In the mid-1970s, New York City was plunged into terror.
I can't tell you what effect this series of crimes had on the city of New York.
People in the area lived in a great deal of fear.
Innocent young couples were being slayed on the streets.
There was no rhyme or rhythm or reason. Had no idea where he was going to pop up next.
Literally, everybody who walked the streets were terrified.
The killer called himself the Son of Sam.
When he got the urge to kill, he would scan the streets of the city of New York.
But what made him murder? Was he warped by his experiences?
This was a terribly, pathetically lonely young man.
Or was the Son of Sam born to kill?
These individuals are hardwired so that their killing is part of their sexual arousal pattern.
It's changed. This used to be a park house that's somewhere in the middle over here before they renovated this park years back.
In the summer of 1977, after meeting just a week earlier, 20-year-olds Robert Violante and Stacy Moskowitz were out on their first date.
We had gone out to a movie first, and then we drove over here to where we're sitting now. We came out into the park. It was a summer night. It was nice out, and we felt like two little kids. I said, "How about we let's go for playing a swing for a little while." When I had walked by the park, I had just saw some guy hanging out, and didn't think anything of it. And then we had gone into my car. We sat in my car, and then the next thing, all I remember was hearing a couple of loud noises, like bangs. The first thing I had heard was a moan coming from Stacy. No, I couldn't see her because I was totally blinded. Something clicked in my head that we must have been shot. Oh my God. We're dead.
The attack was to be the final chilling act of the most notorious killer in New York's history. The 29th of July, 1976, 1 year earlier. 18-year-old Donna Laurie and her friend, 19-year-old Jody Valenti, are sitting in a parked car, talking after a night out. A man approaches, draws a gun, and fires 3 times. Donna is killed almost instantly, but Jody survives and can describe the shooter.
In most police departments, they have what they call a sketch artist. And in these particular incidents, the survivors of these shootings, we got sketches.
The gunman was a stocky white male with curly or bushy hair. And crucially, unlike most New York homicides, he had no known connection to the victim. Over the following winter months of 1976, there would be 2 further unprovoked shootings, injuring 4 more victims, this time in the borough of Queens.
The memory of the case is seared in my memory for all time, like all other New Yorkers who were around at that time. These killings began as sort of random events.
There was no rhyme or rhythm or reason.
However, there were similarities between the crimes.
Many of the shootings took place in dark lovers' lane areas where, young people might be parking, and a man would approach and open fire.
Clearly a serial sexual murder, in my judgment. Take a look at who he's shooting. He's shooting women. He's shooting them in lovers' lanes. These individuals are hardwired so that their behavior, their killing, is part of their sexual arousal pattern. That's why they repeat it, because it is so sexually arousing and sexually stimulating.
On the 30th of January 1977, another shooting. Detective Sergeant Joseph Coffey was assigned to the case.
I was called in to investigate a homicide that occurred in Queens County. It was the homicide of a girl named Christine Freund, and she was sitting in a car with a boyfriend.
26-year-old Christine and her boyfriend John had returned to their car after a night out, when without warning, a gunman opened fire.
And it was a brutal killing. She was shot in the head several times.
As with the first 3 attacks, the shooter was unknown to the victims and had immediately fled the scene of the crime. The evidence began to point to a serial killer.
It became apparent that the same weapon, a .44 caliber revolver, was being used in all of the killings.
But ballistics results were inconclusive.
Ballistics of the bullets involved did not match because of the nature of the type of gun that was used. It was a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog. That gun was fashioned for sky marshals, and the gun was of such a nomenclature that it was made that you could fire it from within an aeroplane and not penetrate the fuselage. So that means the ballistics of the bullet coming out of the gun was limited.
5 weeks later, just 1 street away, the gun was used again. "19-year-old student Virginia Voskerichian was found dead.
She was shot in the street by an unknown perpetrator who came up to her and fired at her, and she had put her school books up in front of her, and the bullet went through the school books and lodged in her brain. We were able to compare the bullet that we recovered from her skull to the original shooting that we took from the body of Donna Lauria. Because we were able to do that, we were able to determine that we had a serial killer.
Five attacks had left 3 dead and 4 injured, and now news spread that a serial killer was stalking the streets of New York.
People were afraid to go out. It was a terrifying experience.
I mean, it was a time where one man could terrorize an entire city of 8 million people. Literally everybody who walked the streets, particularly women, were terrified.
But the mystery killer's reign of terror had only just begun. In early 1977, the citizens of New York had been plunged into panic by the news that a serial killer was loose on their streets. 5 attacks had already left 3 dead and 4 wounded. And in the early hours of the 17th of April, the killer struck again. Detective Joseph Coffey is called to the Bronx.
That shooting, he killed 2 people, a boy and a girl in a car, again, having a liaison in the car, and he came up and killed both of them.
20-year-old Alexander Esau and 18-year-old Valentina Siriani had both been shot twice. As usual, the killer had fled the scene. But this time, there was a twist.
In the shooting in the Bronx, a letter was left. The letter was addressed to Captain Joseph Borelli, who was working the case with me.
In part, the letter read, "I am a monster. I am the son of Sam. I look out the attic window and watch the world go by. I feel like an outsider. I'm on a different wavelength than everybody else. Programmed to kill." Although police didn't know it, it had been written by a 23-year-old resident of an apartment block in Yonkers, David Richard Berkowitz. So who was this hunter who called himself the son of Sam? And had he, as he claimed, been programmed to kill?
His past life had a significant bearing, I believe, on whom his victims were.
David Berkowitz was born Richard David Falco on the 1st of June 1953. The result of an extramarital affair, he was immediately given up for adoption to childless couple Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz.
The Berkowitzes doted on their adopted son, but Berkowitz was very much like his adoptive parents socially in that he was isolated and quite lonely. He had very poor social skills and was regarded in the Bronx community where he was brought up as a bit of a bully and a loner.
The young Berkowitz would have sudden outbursts of anger and violence, leading to his adoptive parents taking him to a psychiatrist.
Of interest is that he always had tried to belong in his school. He didn't fit. He was kind of a loner, but not in the sense that you would be worried about him. He had no behavior problems, but he also had no friends that he felt close to.
Throughout his adolescence, there is no recorded incidents of Berkowitz having a girlfriend. It's interesting to speculate that his choice of targets are usually young women or young courting women who are in the company of their boyfriend might be seen as a way of Berkowitz acting out his inability to establish his own form of relationship with a girlfriend.
At 14 years old, Berkowitz would be devastated by the death of his adoptive mother, Pearl, from breast cancer.
This seems to have been a crisis in his life. His grades at school will dive, he loses his faith in God, and so forth. And especially the kind of underlying problems that Berkowitz, the adult, is going to show are going to become exacerbated when his adoptive father remarries and he does not get on with his new stepmother, and his feelings of being isolated, of women abandoning him, become more and more exacerbated.
At 18, he joins the army.
He went off into the service, spent a year in Korea, spent a year in no uncertain terms of just getting intoxicated on drugs every single day.
After serving overseas, Berkowitz was then posted back to the US, stationed in Virginia.
No drugs anymore, and instead we have a very, very lonely young man, not knowing what to do with himself, who finds himself in the midst of a very intense Baptist region. And in the fullness of time, he converts. But this is not somebody who really has found God, but really of wanting to be accepted and loved by others. This was a terribly, pathetically lonely young man.
Disillusioned with army life, Berkowitz quits and returns to New York. He makes contact with his natural mother, who reveals the circumstances of his birth and adoption.
He found out who his real parents were. It turned out his mother's married name was Italian, and that the man by whom she had fathered the child was Jewish. They had an extramarital affair. And this, I think, plays a direct role in whom he was watching, which couples he sought out. They were either Italian or Jewish. And he would later write this, or say this, that he was in effect displacing his resentment at his parents, real parents, for having had him and then put him up for adoption, that is, as he would view it, abandoned him.
Living alone in New York, Berkowitz finds work as a security guard and a taxi driver. He develops an obsession for starting fires.
Berkowitz set 1,488 fires before he started killing people. How do we know that? He documented it very carefully in his diary.
No real intent for damage, but to be able to call out for help or for succor or support by turning in a fire alarm and watching the fire engines come out. That's what he was so seeking of some kind of external response.
These fires, in my judgment, were sexually motivated as well, because look at the power and control that you can have by setting a fire. You could set a building on fire, a car, a field. And for these individuals, that type of control is eroticized. It's sexually stimulating to them to do that type of thing.
In 1976, Berkowitz moved to a top-floor apartment in Yonkers, New York. Neighbors began to notice strange incidents.
There was many dogs being killed, primarily German Shepherds. It seemed like every day a dead dog would turn up in the neighborhood, either here, back in the woods behind the house, in the woods at this end of the house, or the woods over at that end. And fires, frequent fires in this area, including the same apartment number in the various buildings, 1, 2, and 3. The house you can see far back there, apartment building, almost took off the whole corner of the building.
One neighbor in particular was singled out for special attention.
David Berkowitz lived in the back far corner of the building, and if you look down, you would see a street that was on, that Sam Carr's house was on. Sam Carr had a black Labrador that lived in the backyard in a doghouse.
Sam Carr's dog would bark incessantly through the night. Berkowitz began writing anonymous threatening letters to Sam, eventually shooting and injuring the dog.
He has underlying mental health problems in which it's not a question of switching on and switching off those mental health problems. It's a question of his disordered thinking is actually what patterns his consistent behavior day in, day out.
In June 1976, David Berkowitz travels to Texas and pays a surprise call on a former Army acquaintance, Bill Parker.
Berkowitz showed up unexpectedly at his house and said, "I'd like to buy a weapon, but in Texas you need a driver's license to buy a weapon." So Parker accommodated him and went into a pawn shop. Berkowitz pointed out the .44 caliber Charter Arms revolver, and Parker bought it, and then he gave it to Berkowitz, not knowing that a few weeks later the Son of Sam killings would begin in New York City.
By the spring of 1977, Berkowitz had claimed the lives of 5 young people. But his reign of terror was far from over. By April of 1977, serial killer, the Son of Sam, had claimed the lives of 5 victims and injured more in a series of attacks that had sent shockwaves through the city of New York. On the 19th of April, in an effort to quell the growing hysteria and track down the killer, police established the Omega Task Force.
Operation Omega was the task force set up for the purpose of capturing him in the act of one of his shootings. We combined the detective forces, which were investigators from all over New York City, with the patrol force, which were the uniform cops in New York City, to the point where we had 300 to 400 detectives and uniform patrols on the streets of New York, particularly in the boroughs of Queens and the Bronx, looking to catch this individual in the act of committing his crimes.
On the 30th of May, while hundreds of officers were trying to track him down, the son of Sam spoke out again, this time writing to the New York Daily News. The letter began, "Hello from the gutters of New York City, which are filled with dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine and blood. Hello from the sewers of New York City, which swallow up these delicacies when they are washed away by the sweeper trucks. Hello from the cracks in the sidewalks of New York City, and from the ants that dwell in these cracks and feed on the dried blood of the dead." It continued, "I am still here, like a spirit roaming the night, thirsty, hungry, seldom stopping to rest, anxious to please Sam."
These individuals are very often highly narcissistic, and it's not unusual at all for them to want publicity, to follow the publicity in the media, and to get some sort of stimulation as a result of that, because in their mind, they think that they're smarter than the police, they're smarter than everybody.
People were very nervous, apprehensive. They saw ghosts in all the shadows. Girls cut their hair, long hair that made it short, changed the color. The nightclubs, bars, dance halls, all losing business. Streets were empty. Everybody was just terrified.
Night after night, a massive task force patrolled the streets across New York and staked out lovers' lanes. But no one knew if, when, or where the killer might strike again. On June the 26th, they found out.
As soon as we got here, we knew it was the son of Sam. Yeah, it was a hot summer night, 1977. And that particular night, I got a call over the air that a shooting occurred at this location, which occurred right up the block here. 2 young people in the car, both shot. Discotheque here with hundreds of young people inside. Patrol cars all over the place, a scene of panic, people in the streets. The uniformed police responded, cordoned off the area. We conducted our forensic investigation, and we also canvassed the area of witnesses.
Although injured, both victims survived and were able to describe the attack.
As both people come out of the club, went into the car, he showed up exactly like he did in prior occasions, 2 people making out in the car, and he come up behind them and fired into the car, firing at the girl and hit the male also.
Stalking, hiding up, trying to catch lovers unawares would be very much part of what would give a sexual thrill. He's invading a space which should be private.
So far, all the attacks had taken place in the boroughs of Queens or the Bronx, and most of the female victims targeted had had long dark hair. It was on the 31st of July 1977 when 20-year-old Robert Violante had set out for his first date with the young girl he'd met a week earlier.
The night before, I was out in one of our local nightclubs that we hung out in all the time. And I was standing outside in front, just getting some air with a buddy of mine. And I had said to Louis, I said, Louis, You ever hear the expression, you feel it in your bones, you got that gut wrenching feeling? I said, Louis, I just have it in my gut that he's gonna either hit Brooklyn tonight or tomorrow night, meaning Saturday night. I just knew it, I just felt it. The next night, that same feeling was like 1,000,000 miles away from me. Had no feeling at all. But I won't forget leaving my house, and as I was walking down the stairs, my mom turned to me and said, Robert, just be careful. And I turned to her and I said, you know, don't worry, not gonna. I said, she's a blonde.
Later that night, Robert and Stacy were sitting in his parked car when 3 shots rang out.
The bullet entered directly into my eye and came straight across. And, you know, I lost the left eye, just destroyed everything on the left side, and it did a lot of damage on my right eye.
20-year-old Stacy had also been hit in the head.
So instinctively, I remember that right outside my door was a lamppost. Just came out, and I guess I wrapped it around this way, and this hand, my right hand, went into ringing the horn. I knew to get attention, and I was just screaming at the same time, help us, we've been shot, we've been shot.
The young couple were rushed to hospital. Robert lost one eye and most of the sight in the other. 36 hours after the attack, Stacy Moskowitz was pronounced dead.
I felt terrible. I really did. She was such a sweet girl. Even though I had only met her on my first date, I just knew she was a very, very sweet girl.
It was the first time the son of Sam had struck in Brooklyn. Detective Ed O'Sullivan was assigned to the case.
The homicide squad in Brooklyn during that homicide was so positive. They were up. They were, we're going to get him. You can just feel it. I said, you came to the wrong place, buddy.
A few days later, an eyewitness came forward. They had spotted a suspicious-looking man near the scene of the crime. They described how he looked agitated after receiving a parking ticket. The Brooklyn detectives traced the ticket and vehicle.
Was registered to David Berkowitz with an address in Yonkers.
The name of the car owner was one they had seen before amongst thousands of tip-offs.
A company called IBI had some information about a guy named Berkowitz who worked for them, who was a bit of a nut job. You ought to look into him. So we started to look into him. Also at that time, we got an individual who called us and came into our office by the name of Sam Carr, who said to us, I have a lunatic who lives near me. He shot my dog, and his name is David Berkowitz. And then we have the parking violation ticket on the car at the scene of the killing of Stacy Moskowitz. 2 + 2 + 2 equals David Berkowitz.
On the 10th of August, police assembled in Yonkers.
It was a hot summer day, and it was unusual in the sense that this is a very quiet neighborhood. Commonly, you see a police car out here on occasion. This day, there was a conglomerate of them. They were up and down the street this way, one right in front of my house, and on the street far up there was about 4 or 5 of them. David Berkowitz came out of the building, seemingly oblivious to the world, and walked to his car, which went right over about where that silver car is, right over there. As soon as he opened the door, he got into his car, they surrounded him.
At that time, the 2 detectives got out of the car. One name was John Filatico, the other one was Sergeant Gardella. Filatico went up to the driver's side of the car. Berkowitz was already in the car. He had his gun out, and he said, "Put your hands on the dashboard and don't move." Berkowitz turned to Detective Filatico and said, "You got me." Filatico says to him, "Who do I have?" He says, "You have the son of Sam." And on the seat in the car that he was sitting in was a paper bag. In that paper bag was the .44 caliber gun that did all of the shootings.
He was done in by a parking ticket. Had that parking ticket not been placed on his vehicle, I don't know how many other people he would have shot or killed before he was apprehended.
Once in custody, Berkowitz would make an extraordinary claim.
He got messages because the dog spoke to him. And when the dog spoke to him, according to Berkowitz, relaying the message from the devil, it was time to kill. That's when he went out and killed.
In August of 1977, 24-year-old David Berkowitz admitted he was the son of Sam, a serial killer who had terrorized the streets of New York for a year.
The night he was caught, there was all sorts of celebrations. They were giving away drinks in all the bars.
With Berkowitz in custody, investigators would now try to discover what had motivated his crimes. Interviewing him for the first time, Detective Sergeant Joseph Coffey could never have predicted Berkowitz's explanation.
We spoke to him about each killing, how he did it, in detail from A to Z. For 3 hours, he sat there, and he never blinked his eyes, and he had a constant smile on his face. And he went through chapter and verse of every shooting and killing that he did, from the first one to the night we captured him. He told us that his motivation was his connection to the devil. The devil told him to kill these women. The devil told him when to do it, and the devil communicated to him through the dog that belonged to Sam Carr. He felt that the devil had a power over him, and he had to go out and do the devil's bidding.
He was being compelled. He was told to go out and seek victims. When he killed a young lady, she would be possessed and used by these ulterior forces, but at the end of a year, he could then have the young lady.
Quite clearly, he's paranoid, and quite clearly, he's also schizophrenic. So I think what's driving David Berkowitz is ultimately the voices he hears in his head telling him to satisfy those voices, he needs to take other people's lives.
When Berkowitz told us that he was doing these killings and these shootings at the behest of the devil, we looked at each other that we are definitely dealing with a lunatic here.
The judge ordered that a competency hearing be held with respect to Berkowitz. Now, this is common, of course, in any case where the court suspects mental illness.
There was what we called the insanity plea, where if you had a severe mental illness and you didn't appreciate your wrongfulness of your conduct, you would be found essentially not guilty by reason of insanity.
Dr. Daniel Schwartz was asked to assess Berkowitz's mental state.
At the time I examined him for the court, I and my associate studied him many, many hours. It was to see whether or not he was able to face his criminal charges, or conversely, whether or not he was so overwhelmed by mental illness that it prevented him from rationally addressing his charges.
You have to ask the question, would they have actually abducted the victim if there was a police officer or two standing around? And the answer is no, because they didn't want to get arrested. So they can control it to some degree, but they choose not to control it.
Of course, he was mentally ill to do this. Whether or not he was legally responsible, probably in retrospect, probably, because he chose darkness in which to commit the crimes, and he invariably left the crime scene, suggesting by his behavior that he knew that what he was doing was wrong.
Berkowitz's modus operandi was very simple. When he got the urge to kill, he would scan the streets of the city of New York, and he would drive around looking for an opportunity to kill.
He went at times to appropriate places where he knew that a couple would drive to have a little privacy and to be romantic.
He wasn't a process-focused killer. In other words, he didn't enjoy being in the company of his victims, torturing his victims, staying with his victims. He was an act-processed serial killer. In other words, what he wanted to achieve was simply the death of his victims. Because he was a hit-and-run killer, often showing just a great deal of random behavior, it was much more difficult for the police to be able to catch him.
Although Berkowitz had confessed to the attacks, there were fears that a trial might see him found not guilty by reason of insanity.
After several weeks, he told me that he was feeling increasingly depressed, regretful, guilty for what he had done.
Berkowitz was allowed to consult with a preacher.
There was a Baptist woman. She saw him, and I'll never forget what happened. She saw him alone. He would ask her a question. She would then talk to God. God would then ostensibly answer her, and she would repeat the answer to David. And when they came out an hour later, she went on her way. He walked down the hall towards me. He had this incredible glow on his face that he had just met God again. And so he came out of this informing me and his attorneys that he was going to plead guilty. And nothing could change his mind. Attorneys spent hours with him. I was present several times, trying to convince him to plead insanity.
On the 5th of August 1978, Berkowitz appeared in court.
Everybody was surprised when Berkowitz walked into court, and instead of demanding a trial, he pled guilty to everything. And so the biggest case in the United States, the most highly publicized serial killer in the United States, suddenly pled guilty, and that was pretty much the end of the case.
On the 6th of December, Berkowitz was sentenced to a total of 365 years in prison. So what made Berkowitz murder? Was it the discovery of his adoption? Was it his unstable and isolated life? Or was the son of Sam simply born to kill?
He was not born to kill. In the sense of, can you say that there is a definite urge there to do it? He had the genetic makeup, yes. But the genetics was added onto by the environment. It was added onto by his maturing into his adolescent years, where the brain function starts to work on the gene, and then you have all of the beginning fantasies to kill.
So we've got a great deal of anger in his life about adoptive mothers who will die and therefore leave him, stepmothers coming into his life that he doesn't like. So these are the patterns of behavior that make David Berkowitz the killer that he became. But was he born to kill? I don't think David Berkowitz was born to kill. I think how he was socialized over a long period of time turned him into a killer.
I think a compelling case could be made that Berkowitz was born to kill. I think that there are certain kinds of mental illness that are hardwired into people. I mean, I think the more neurologists study the brain, the more they find that the presence of certain chemicals in the brain and the way they operate can compel people to engage in certain activities. And it seems clear to me that he suffered from severe mental illness and that mental illness drove him to kill.
What it is not is a result of poor parenting or some watershed event that happens in someone's life. There's thousands and thousands of people that have been adopted and don't do anything even close to what Berkowitz did. Berkowitz is a serial sexual murderer, and these individuals murder because there's a fusion of sex and aggression so that the aggressive act itself is eroticized. It's sexually stimulating for them. That's why they repeat it, because it is so sexually arousing and sexually stimulating. A number of people have said the overwhelming majority of serial sexual murderers kill up close and personal. Very, very rarely do they shoot somebody. Therefore, how do you explain David Berkowitz falling within that category? But you have to look at the first victim. The first victim that Berkowitz tried to kill was a woman, and he did it with a knife, except he didn't kill her. And so he then reverted to a method of killing that he was most comfortable with.
Psychiatrist Dr. Daniel Schwartz, who had examined David Berkowitz after his capture, would later receive a letter from prison.
He wrote me a letter, the substance of which was that all of these statements about God and the demons and so on were malingering, faking. In fact, his letter reads to begin with, quote, "I'm a faker. I made the demon story all up from the beginning. The reason for this was to try to mentally justify and cause for the crimes I committed. I knew there were no real demons, witches, talking dogs, and satanic henchmen. When I started committing these crimes, I had no idea of what motivated me. I decided that the demons as a cause would be appropriate. This is also why I pleaded guilty, because I knew I was."
I mean, what makes a person a killer? I don't know, I'll never understand that totally, But, I don't believe anybody's born like that to have that in them, but I really don't know for sure. All the victims and lives that they destroyed were just innocent kids, just all having fun, just all at the prime of their life. And, even the survivors, tremendous trauma, but I hope they're all doing well in their lives. I had never thought about that too much, but I'm saying it now that I just hope they're all doing well.
In the early 1970s, the idyllic Californian seaside town of Santa Cruz would be plunged into panic.
One day there would be a body part found somewhere or washing in from the ocean.
Innocent young women were being raped, murdered, and dismembered.
He picked up a sack with the remains and then heaved it over.
And all the while, the elusive killer was right under the noses of the cops that pursued him.
He had a great personality. He was a likable guy.
What kind of man could commit such heinous crimes?
He would have oral sex with a decapitated head.
Was he a terrible product of his environment?
His mother would lock him in the basement room at night because she had this idea that he could possibly sexually assault his sisters.
Or was the co-ed butcher born to kill?
He just erupted. Ah!
Santa Cruz up through the 60s was a small beach town. It was a surf town and it was a retirement town. Then the university popped onto the scene in 1965. It was the dawn of the hippies, of the age of Aquarius. So there was a very free and easy feel to life here.
A lot of the counterculture that essentially bled over from San Francisco area and came down here, a lot of the so-called the hippie types ended up forming communes here in Santa Cruz County. And that was attractive to a lot of young people, and including young girls. And people were coming from all over the country just to live that free and liberating lifestyle.
But in 1972, the peace in Santa Cruz would be shattered.
All of a sudden, there were bodies being washed in on the ocean. There were grisly discoveries. And the thought was from a lot of people in town, what the hell is happening to our little paradise?
We were dealing with a lot of missing person reports.
It became clear that somebody was killing young co-ed hitchhikers.
18-year-old Fresno college student Anita Luquesa vanishes.
A severed head found in the mountain.
It was just the skull. We had no body.
Mary Ann Pesh, an 18-year-old co-ed and talented skier, disappears.
It became a very confusing time for homicide investigators.
15-year-old ballet dancer Aiko Koo, abducted.
It just seemed like a world gone crazy.
Cindy Shawl, 18 years old and babysitting to earn her way through college, goes missing.
I remember at the time very much wanting to get him. I mean, get him off the streets, catch him, put him away.
The media christened the mystery killer the co-ed butcher.
Whenever we see somebody under the age of 18 who was hitchhiking, we would pick them up and take them to juvenile hall. And there became a big outcry of that we were violating their right to hitchhike, but in reality is that we were just trying to save their lives.
And it went on. 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe vanishes from the Santa Cruz campus.
Every time we have a missing person report, we're just fearful that this was going to be another homicide victim.
And 21-year-old student Alison Liu disappears forever.
We had no clue as to who was doing this.
They didn't know what the hell was going on. And indiscriminate murder cases are extremely hard to solve because there's no rhyme nor reason.
Because the culture at the time was, there was a lot of drugs going on here and a lot of the so-called hippie movement. I suppose individually we may have thought it may have had something to do with that.
In April 1973, as part of a routine firearms inquiry, Detective Michael Alufi would come face to face, not with a drug-crazed hippie, but with a short-haired, conservative young man, popular with local police.
The sheriff's office that I worked for at the time received what we call a dealer's record of sale.
One of our records clerks brought back to us a file card and said, you know, this guy just tried to buy a gun and his record was expunged, but I could see through the blackout that he was involved in a murder in Madera County some years ago.
Affectionately known as Big Ed, the 25-year-old, 6'9", 280-pound Edmund Kemper was a regular fixture at Cops Bar, the jury room.
He would come down to a local watering hole that us police officers would go to after work and hang out and talk with us. He was had a great personality. He was very friendly, very outgoing, and he was a likable guy.
The discussion became, well, who's going to go take the gun away from this guy? Because when you look at his dealer's record of sale, he's 6 feet 8.5 and 285 pounds. So he's a pretty big guy. So being the junior detective, I drew the straw.
There was some apprehension involved, just due to the guy's size. Big man, big gun, and little old me.
Although unfamiliar to Alufi, the gun owner was definitely not considered a suspect in the co-ed killings. Big Ed lived with his mother on a pleasant, peaceful suburban street. But the address was unclear.
We parked right there, and we looked around, couldn't find much of anything. There were several places that had basically the same address, so we weren't sure which one was his. We were, I'm just guessing at this point, right around this point right here, when a car came around the curve and pulled up right there where that car is. I told Don, I said, let me go ask this guy if he knows where Kemper is. So as I approached the car, there was a gentleman in the car lying across the front seat with the door open, and he was fiddling underneath the dashboard. And I was just about to this point when I said, excuse me, I'd like to speak with you for a second. When he got out of the car, he got out of the car, and he got out of the car, and he got out of the car. And immediately I knew that this was Mr. Kemper, the man I was looking for, because he towered over me, and I'm 6 feet tall. So from here, we explained that, you know, what we needed to do. We needed to take his weapon to make sure that he was authorized to have that legally. We came to the trunk, and he had his keys in his pocket, and he went to put the key in there. And so my partner and I instinctively, whether it be instinct or training, separated, and I came around to this side of the car on the trunk, and my partner was on the other side, and we had our hands on the guns. The only thing that was in the trunk was a bundle, like in a blanket of some sort, a towel. He started to reach in for it, and I said, no, wait a minute, let me get it. I reached in the trunk, got the bundle, and inside of that was the weapon we were looking for. And I noticed there was nothing in the trunk, no liner in the trunk or anything. I thought that was a little strange, but we took the handgun and we left.
Alufi handed the gun in at the station and thought no more about it. Two weeks later, 5 o'clock in the morning, Officer Jim Connor is on the night shift when he overhears a colleague taking a call from the gun owner.
Knowing Ed, I got on the phone and we started talking. I could tell that something wasn't right. He was in Pueblo, Colorado. He was in a phone booth, and he hadn't had any sleep for several days. And he said he had done something really bad. He said that he had killed his mother and a friend of hers. He said that they were at his house, and he asked me if I knew Mickey Alufi, and I said yes. And he says, well, my house is hard to find. Mickey knows how to find it very easily because he had been out there and had confiscated a gun.
Officers contacted Detective Alufi at his home.
I'm standing there getting all this information and giving all this information, and I have this tremendous feeling of all of the blood just rushing out of my body. It was just, oh my God, this is unreal. One of the deputies broke the back window, which is on the other side of the sliding glass door. And then we started looking to see if we could locate the bodies in the closet. We pulled back a sheet and we saw some hair and some blood.
Then Big Ed Kemper made a startling confession.
He made comments to Jim Connor on the telephone that he had killed all of the co-eds too.
Taken into custody, 24-year-old Edmund Kemper would then reveal an extraordinary and sickening tale. In the early 1970s, the Californian beach resort of Santa Cruz had been stunned by the mysterious disappearance of a series of young college girls and a catalogue of gruesome discoveries. Then in April 1973, 24-year-old, 6'9" Edmund Kemper unexpectedly confessed that he was the infamous co-ed butcher, and that he now had a tally of 10 murder victims to his name. Taken into custody, he would now reveal his extraordinary story.
The co-ed killer had such a fascinating life.
Born in 1948, Edmund Kemper was the middle child of 3.
His mother and his father were very strict disciplinarians. There was no leeway one way or the other.
Growing up in Burbank, California, Kemper looked up to his father, but had difficulties with his mother, Clarnell.
She was a punitive person that he resented greatly.
She was harsh, aggressive, putting him down, I think, when he was younger. Call it verbally abusive, I don't know, but very, very aggressive verbally.
In 1957, after years of unhappy marriage, the 9-year-old Edmund's parents divorced. Clarnell, Edmund, and his 2 sisters moved away. Kemper was already behaving oddly.
He showed a lot of pathology as a child. He would cut off the heads of his sister's dolls, in other ways deform the dolls.
At 10, he had made a comment that if he ever had to kiss his teacher, he would have to kill her. And when you think about a 9 and 10-year-old at that point having that kind of a thought process, you begin to wonder, you know, what is it about him?
The young Kemper was developing a violent fantasy life. He moved from dismembering dolls to harming animals. He admitted once burying a cat alive, later digging its body up to play with.
There's many, many serial sexual murderers that have a background of killing cats, torturing cats, tormenting cats. Why cats? Because cats are a female symbol.
Kemper was showing warning signs that the FBI have since identified as common amongst a number of serial killers.
Basically, you're dealing with a young male that is engaged in fantasies that are aberrant and destructive and violent before adolescent. You're looking at an individual that has a broken home, a cold and distant mother, a absent father through divorce or just abandonment. They get into animal torturing. There are patterns that are identifiable.
Kemper grew taller, stronger and stranger.
His mother put him in the basement room and would lock him in at night because she had this idea that he could possibly sexually assault his sisters.
He described it as having a cot and a sleeping bag and a light hanging down from the ceiling with just a bare bulb and a string. Talked about it as being a very difficult time in his life, very scary. He could hear rats running around at night, that kind of thing.
As a teenager, Kemper left his mother, heading to Los Angeles to seek out the dad he idolized.
He had hoped to go and live with his father, and he described to me that when he went there, he was rejected by his father.
Edmund Kemper was sent to live with his paternal grandparents on their remote farm. Here, the troubled teenager's violent fantasies would be realized for the first time.
He found his grandmother to be an authoritarian and a disciplinarian, like his mother.
His grandfather was out shopping or whatever, and he took a .22 and shot and killed his grandmother. When he realized his grandfather would be coming home and finding his wife dead, they were elderly, he decided he couldn't allow his grandfather to go through that trauma. So when his grandfather came in, he shot and killed him.
He said he didn't want the grandfather to suffer knowing that his wife was dead. It's the most bizarre statement. I mean, you don't go out and just shoot somebody to keep them from finding out that their wife is dead.
Kemper was diagnosed a paranoid schizophrenic and sent to the secure Atascadero State Hospital.
That was a very harmful place for him to be institutionalized. He certainly learned a lot of bad things.
Dr. William Schanberger was one of the facility's staff.
In those days, we had 1,600 patients in the hospital. There were probably several dozen people who had committed murder. 800 mentally disordered sex offenders. We had psychology staff of only 10 people or so.
Although not Kemper's therapist, Schanberger would have regular contact with the inmate.
Ed is a bright fellow, and that was obvious when you were talking with him. He was kind of a model patient.
The likable Kemper soon became a trusted assistant to the psychology staff that dealt with the hundreds of sex offenders.
He had so much access to the records, and there would be detailed descriptions of the methods used in carrying out the crimes, techniques of deception.
Remember, he was 15 when he went into the mental hospital, and he really had never had any sexual experience at all.
Generally, what you'll find is that the child will pursue these violent fantasies, and in adolescence, the sexual element will come on board, and they will have sexual fantasies that develop along the lines of using people as an object rather than a partner. They want to do something to somebody, not with somebody.
He had a fantasy life. He described himself as masturbating numerous times during a day when he was in the mental hospital.
As part of his duties, Kemper had access to the hospital's psychological test papers.
Kemper was very smart. He knew what psychiatrists and psychologists wanted to hear. He knew all the criteria for different diagnoses. They treated him, and I think they thought they cured him.
After 5 years in the secure hospital, Edmund Kemper, now 20 years old and 6 feet 9 inches tall, was released.
He was discharged, by the way, to the youth authority with the recommendation not for him to live with his mother. Unfortunately, the youth authority didn't follow that advice, and he wound up living with his mother.
His social life, I'd say, was very inadequate as he described it. Felt particularly inadequate around women. So I think he was lonely.
Here was a young man, he's 21, 22, and he probably never had a date in his life. Probably have the usual interest and needs to connect with women. What can you tell someone about yourself? That I murdered my grandparents and I was in a mental hospital for the last 5 years of my life. I can't imagine how difficult it would have had to be. That doesn't excuse anything, but it, in my mind, describes the situation. So he started picking up co-eds, and some of them he wound up murdering and doing even worse things at times.
In custody, Edmund Kemper would reveal to investigators the full horror of his extraordinary crimes, in minute and graphic detail.
It's about as serious and complex series of sexual pathologies as I've come across.
He said a lot of things that they're kind of disturbing.
In 1973, after the disappearance and murder of half a dozen young college girls, detectives held Edmund Kemper in custody. And the 6'9" killer was eager to talk. Leading detectives to the scenes of his crimes, he would explain his murders in chilling detail to anybody who'd listen.
He talked and talked and talked, and just gave every bit of information you could ever dream of. And he goes into great detail about the things that he did to these girls.
Most of the serial killers I've worked with fall into two distinct types. One group of serial killers will never like to talk about their offending behavior at all. Whereas the second group of serial killers are desperate to talk about their killing. They're desperate to be at the heart of the story.
He said a lot of things that they're kind of disturbing.
Investigators learned how Kemper had taken months to develop his strategy for abduction.
He spent a lot of time traveling all over Central California and even down into Los Angeles. And what he would do is he would find hitchhikers and he would essentially do a practice run.
As he would drive off with the young women, he would look over at them, think about fondling their breasts, and have great sexual curiosity about them.
Over numerous trips, Kemper honed his harmless persona and perfected his plans. Only then did he feel confident enough to act out his fantasies. On the 7th of May, 1972, Edmund Kemper picked up two 18-year-old friends, Mary Ann Pesch and Anita Luchesa, near the university campus in Berkeley.
They would get in the car and he would drive off, and immediately he would say, "Oh, I don't think your car door is closed." And he's huge, he's a big man. He could reach all the way across the car, open it, close it, and then he would drop a chapstick behind that mechanism. So if they became afraid or they wanted to get out, it wouldn't allow the mechanism to work.
Kemper drove them to a remote spot. He told detectives that, holding the girls at gunpoint, he had forced Anita to climb into the trunk. He then returned to the car and stabbed Mary Ann until she was dead.
Just think about Anita Lukesha in the trunk, listening to her best friend being stabbed and hearing her screaming. I mean, you know, it's pretty heavy stuff, actually.
Kemper then opened the trunk and killed Anita. He took the dead girls to an apartment he was renting. There he dismembered them before dumping their remains in the mountains. All the while, the police hunted the mysterious co-ed butcher. The seemingly harmless Edmund Kemper was sitting next to them in their favorite bar.
I remember Ed being there on many occasions, especially during the time of the homicides that were going on. He would come in and have a few beers with the guys. He was a likable guy.
While he was with them, he was able to think about, here I am, an ongoing murderer, and they don't know anything about it, and they fully accept me, and I'm one of the boys. He was a police groupie, actually, is the best way of describing it.
Many serial sexual murderers have a fascination with police. That's part of their psychology. And they do that for a number of different reasons. To hang out with them was one, but they also sometimes can follow the investigation and see if they're talking about it at all. This is very stimulating for them.
It was just talk about, you know, a girl found here, a girl found there, and body parts washed up on shore, this kind of thing. It was a conversation among the guys when we were at the jury room.
On the 14th of September 1972, Kemper spotted 15-year-old ballet student Aiko Koo hitchhiking. She'd missed her bus and was worried about being late for a dance class.
She had made a sign because she missed the bus. She needed to get to San Francisco. She was very young, small, easy to overpower. Got in the car. He drove across the bay to San Francisco, but unfortunately for her, just kept going. This little girl was terrified, obviously.
Kemper bound, gagged, and then suffocated his captive. But it was only when Kemper took his victims' bodies home that he could fully act out his twisted fantasies.
With most of them, he would actually have intercourse with the dead woman. He would have sex with her entire body, then sometimes also with the decapitated body. And then sometimes he would have oral sex with the decapitated head.
It's not unusual for a serial murderer to have sexual actions with a decapitated body. It's because it's not a person to them. To them, it's an object.
I have the power to do anything I want with this woman. She's mine, and I can do anything that I'm curious about, do anything I've only dreamed about doing, and nobody can do anything about it. Power is a big part of it, but extreme sexual pathology is another.
In order to evade detection, Kemper would separate his victims' body parts and dump them in different locations. One spot, just minutes from Detective Terry Medina's home.
When I did find out that he was up here, that made me reflect on my wife. You know, we had two small kids up here, and she would be home alone a lot. So that gave me kind of a funny feeling in the pit of your stomach. was a predator. Well, this is would be approximately the place that Kemper parked the car. Very remote. It was even more remote 30 years ago than it is today. There was nothing up here then. It was just in the mountains. Picked up a sack and then carried it right to the edge. And remember, there was no fence here. Heaved it over, and that was the remains of Ikuku. Of all of these murders, that's the one that I think affects me the most as I think about it. I mean, they're all brutal, but that one just seemed to stick with me. There's some, those of us that do murder cases, there's always some that seem to get inside you.
Kemper would go on to claim the lives of 3 more co-ed hitchhikers. 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe, 21-year-old Alison Liu, and 18-year-old Cindy Shaw, babysitter to police officer Jim Connor's kids.
She was young, you know, she needed money like anyone else. She was very pleasant, and knowing that she was a student at the university, we felt very safe that we could, you know, trust her with our children. He had shot her with a .22.
Kemper took Cindy's body to his bedroom in his mother's apartment.
He had dismembered her, but in his mind there was some relationship there. He had an attachment, and he kept her head.
Kemper told detectives he'd hidden Cindy's head in his mother's backyard, beneath his bedroom window.
He buried it. It was about 2 feet down in the backyard, facing his bedroom window, so that there was some connection in his mind.
It was unbelievable, because Ed seemed like, excuse the phrase, a gentle giant, you know, with a very nice personality and likable kind of guy, that he could be responsible for something like that.
In addition to the murder of his grandparents, Edmund Kemper had taken the lives of 6 young women. Next, he would commit a murder he'd dreamed of all his life. By March of 1973, 6 feet 9 inch Edmund Kemper had kidnapped and murdered 6 female co-eds without attracting suspicion. But in April, Detective Michael Aluffi's routine visit to confiscate a firearm had unwittingly sent the suspicious Kemper into panic.
This whole process of me taking the handgun away from him, he was under the impression that I was playing cat and mouse with him.
He thought we were playing a game, that we really knew he was the murderer.
Kemper worried his mother, Clarnell, would now learn of his actions.
He did not want her to suffer the embarrassment of what he did.
Edmund Kemper resolved to finally commit a crime he had fantasized about since he was a child.
He got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, took a hammer, went into his mother's bedroom, just jammed that hammer through her head several times. That was a very messy murder.
Kemper's mother would suffer the same fate as the young co-eds, and more.
He cut off her head, and then he inserted his penis into her mouth.
Put it on the mantle above the fireplace and just yelled and screamed at it. And at times he threw darts at her face. He talked about all the time she had screamed at him and yelled at him or belittled him.
He cut out her vocal cords and tried to destroy them in the garbage disposal unit at the sink because it was her chastising him using those vocal cords that so bothered him.
Fearing his mother's death would soon be discovered by her best friend, Kemper invited her to the house, murdered her, and then fled. It was only after driving for 3 days without rest that he called the police and gave himself up. Detective Medina was sent to the mother's apartment to process the crime scene.
When we arrived, there was nothing disturbed. It looked like somebody had just left on vacation. We flipped over the mattress, and of course it was soaked with blood. And there was a note there. He left a note that said, "Sorry, gents, for the mess, but really had no time." That's the first time in my career, and I've been in this business 43 years, that, you know, the suspect left the cops a note.
The bodies of Kemper's mother and her best friend had been carefully hidden in 2 closets. In October 1973, Edmund Kemper would be tried for multiple murder. Both prosecution and defense searched for the answer to the question on everyone's lips.
Why would this large, friendly, cooperative guy, why would he kill all these people?
Defense investigator Harold Cartwright spent over 100 hours interviewing Kemper.
I never at all felt threatened at any time by, 260 pounds or something, 6'8" or whatever, and he's an enormous man, but he was just sort of like a gentle giant.
But it seems Kemper's demeanor with the opposite sex may have been very different. Cameron Jackson, a graduate psychology student at the time, was asked to perform a standard personality test on him.
I was the only person in the room with him, and I read the questions to him, and he was very cooperative. And then suddenly, just out of the blue, he both sort of started to get up, and he just erupted like a volcano and he's like that, and his hands and everything, and I just went like that backwards, and in immediately came 1 or 2 policemen who calmed everything down. It was just so fast and such an overwhelming rush of anger and emotion and fury. I don't really remember the exact question now that I was asking, but I'm sure it had something to do with women. And I was a woman asking him questions.
In the courtroom, Kemper's taped confessions were played aloud.
I recall sitting in the trial, listening to the taped confession of Kemper and looking around and seeing the face on the parents of the murdered girls. Just the shock and the agony and what they had gone through.
In the coverage of these terrible crimes, I think the most neglected aspect are the victims. There's a brief mention of their names usually. These were all young college girls. They were working towards a career. They might have chosen to have a family. All of that is lost when a murderer comes along and takes them away.
What a tragedy. In those families where A young woman was murdered and taken away. The tragedy of that is as much alive today as it was back in 1972.
On the 8th of November, Edmund Kemper was found guilty of 8 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. So what drove Kemper to take the lives of 10 innocent victims? Was it his broken family life and the alleged emotional abuse from his mother? Or was he simply born to kill?
He only once said something like, it was the way I could control them. And that's the only thing he ever said the entire time I dealt with him that had anything to do with why he did what he did.
Ed Kemper is the classic sociopath.
He feels no guilt. It's all about him, no compassion whatsoever.
It's very difficult to say how he looked at what he was doing. Would a person who walked into a butcher have remorse about cutting up a chicken? I don't know. I doubt it. And I think that's what he looked at, an object that he could dismember.
You know, you look at him and you say, okay, something happened. His wiring was crossed. He had a chemical imbalance. He had something. And then you look at him and you say, no, this is strictly environmental. You know, the way he grew up, all the life experiences that he had led him to the point that he becomes this serial mass murderer. Maybe he was killing his mother all along. Who knows?
I think when we're all studying serial murderers, we want to find something to blame. It's got to be this crazy mother that he had who locked him in the cellar, but she must have felt something. You know, people who are around serial killers for a period of time will pick up some type of a feeling. They can't describe it, but they know something.
There are genetic and biological factors, there are sociological factors, and there are complex psychological factors, all of which interact. And if we're going to ever reduce and prevent these things, we have to attack it on all these levels.
I don't think anybody is born to kill. I think everybody is born with a series of pluses and minuses in their makeup, both physically and mentally and emotionally. I think that things happen to people. Most people are able to cope with it, deal with it. Some people are not.
Several years after Kemper had been incarcerated, a parcel arrived at the home of psychiatrist Dr. William Schanberger, who'd been friendly with the teenage Edmund.
I received in the mail this cup from Ed Kemper. It said that it took him about a year to make, and it's a very, very complex, it's like a battered cup. And on the cup is written also, I beg your pardon. And on the bottom, I never promised you a rose garden. Meaning to be, I think, a very serious apology.
I think there is a side of him that would have given anything to be a normal person. I could see that in him. I could see it while he was testifying. There's a part of Ed Kemper that is as horrified and as disgusted with what he did as the rest of us are.
I'm sure that there's no part of him that is happy with what he wound up doing.
You are a loser, you're a coward, you are nobody, you're an animal.
These are relatives of victims of the Green River Killer.
May God have mercy on your pathetic soul, because the rest of us who know the truth about you won't.
The most prolific serial murderer America has ever known.
The one thing that I want you to know, I was that daughter at home, waiting for my mom to come home.
Whose 19-year reign of terror left the area surrounding Seattle littered with corpses.
I don't wish for him to die. I wish for him to have a long, suffering, cruel death.
But who was the Green River Killer? And was he born to kill?
When he went through the door and left to go to work, he wasn't the man that I knew.
The old Highway 99, adjacent to Seattle's SeaTac Airport. 30 years ago, a notorious spot.
This area, back in the early 80s, had very transient population. There were topless bars over here. There were a lot of hotels where you could rent rooms for an hour or two.
Faye Brooks, then a detective assigned to sex crime cases, was regularly called to the street known simply as the Strip.
There were a lot of young women who were working the streets.
All the girls were young, and some of them had troubled past, but all of them are somebody's daughter and somebody's sister.
A lot of the young girls had grown up in abusive homes, and that was why they were running away. And I could relate to that. I'm a survivor of child sex abuse, and there but for the grace of God were I, and so I could certainly empathize with them, and I also wanted to help them.
One such woman was Marcia Chapman, a street worker who claimed to have been raped.
And the apartment building where she lived was right here.
Marcia was a beautiful, statuesque black woman. She was 31. She had 3 children. She couldn't support them on the job she could get, and she was working as a prostitute.
She was living in an apartment that was sparsely furnished, so I think she was like down on her luck. She seemed to have a kind heart and was a nice person, but under the circumstances, she did what she had to do to make ends meet.
Marcia's alleged rape was typical of the hazards working girls on the Strip faced. At the time, best-selling crime writer Anne Rule lived just blocks from the area.
I would sometimes stop and warn them and say, do you know what I do for a living? I write about murder. And you don't have a chance out here. How do you know who you're getting in with? And usually they would just shrug and walk away.
In 1982, the dangers of working the Strip would be brought home by a discovery in the nearby Green River.
There was a man on the water in a boat, and he saw underneath the water what he thought was a mannequin. It wasn't a mannequin, it was a human being, and there were 2 of them there. Well, one of the victims in the water, her hand was just waving with the current of the water. And it was like, here I am, please help me. But of course, it was too late.
As police investigated the crime scene, they made another grim find.
Processing the scene where the victims were in the water was where we found the 3rd victim on the banks.
They were all within a few feet of each other, and so clearly, the same killer had put all 3 of the bodies there.
All 3 women had been picked up from around the Strip by what the FBI dubbed an organized serial killer.
The organized offender was more planned, more premeditated, was able to conceptualize crimes and carry them out very efficiently, mainly because of the fact that they had very little feeling for another human being. They looked at a victim as an object for their excitement. Basically, you're talking about a sexual psychopath.
The victims were 16-year-old Opal Mills, 17-year-old Cynthia Jean Hines, and 31-year-old Marcia Chapman.
When I found out that it was Marcia, I was I don't think I had any words that I could say. It was like, oh my God, somebody killed her. It was really sad.
We did not know this was only the beginning of a reign of terror, and we wouldn't know who was doing this for a very long time.
On Seattle's Strip, the Green River Killer had found a rich hunting ground that would enable him to amass a body count unrivaled by any serial killer in American history. By autumn of 1982, the bodies of 5 young women had been discovered in or beside Seattle's Green River. They had disappeared from a notorious highway known as the Strip, an area where prostitution was rife. And the Green River Killer had only just begun. On the 15th of September 1982, 18-year-old Mary Bridget Meehan vanishes.
Bridget was the much-loved daughter of a Catholic family in Bellevue, a very rich suburb of Seattle. She skipped school a lot. She joined up with a boyfriend named Ray, and they were living in a cheap motel on Highway 99. She left. I think she was still possibly turning a few tricks, and she didn't come back. Her family was so upset because she was 8.5 months pregnant.
To every serial killer, human beings are objects. There's no emotional connection. There's nothing there.
On the 20th of September, another girl, 15-year-old Deborah Lorraine Estes, disappeared. Yet police were still unable to identify a killer.
This was the area that I was working in. This is the area where the bulk of the Green River victims were picked up from. And we would sit here and look, you know, trying to identify who might be the suspect. We had very dedicated detectives who were determined to solve this case.
On the 26th of September, 16-year-old Linda Jane Rule vanishes.
Linda Rule was a slender blonde girl who lived up in the North End. She had been working the streets, and she had a boyfriend who kind of served as a pimp. She disappeared from an area near the Northgate Mall. Like all serial killers, he seemed to have the ability to sense vulnerability in potential victims. He didn't take the streetwise girls. He was looking for the younger women.
By the end of 1982, 15 girls would be missing or found dead, and pressure was mounting on the sheriff's task force.
People hoped that law enforcement would be successful. There were different rumors that were passing around of who the person might be. There was rampant speculation that it might be even a law enforcement officer because of the easy access that the individual had to the number and variety of women in the community.
You know, the unfortunate thing is some of the women of the street felt like the sheriff's office wasn't investigating the case as hard as we could have because they were street kids and runaways, and that's not true. Everybody assigned to that investigation was committed to solving it, committed to bringing this person to justice, because these were, you know, somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, somebody's mother, and we cared about them. We cared about them like they were our own kids or our own family members, and we wanted to solve it.
Then, on the 30th of April 1983, a young girl was spotted being taken from the Strip.
Maria Malvar, with her boyfriend, were at a restaurant on the highway. Her boyfriend went to make a phone call. When he came back, Maria wasn't in the restaurant. And he was very concerned, and he thought, well, I'll go out on the highway and see if I can find her. And he realized that Maria was in the truck ahead of him. There was a man driving, and then she was talking to the man. And so he determined to follow the truck because he wasn't sure what was going on. He worried about her. And they got up to the stoplight at Highway 99 and 216th. But when he turned left, he couldn't see the car.
Marie's boyfriend returned with her family to search the streets for the pickup truck she'd left in. And in a quiet cul-de-sac, just a few blocks from the strip, they found it, parked outside the modest home of a local truck painter.
And they asked local police, please, to go there because they believed Maria was in that house. One of the sergeants did go there, knocked on the door, a man answered, and he said, there's nobody here but me. And they didn't press it.
All serial killers have the ability to appear so normal that they throw off even people who are considered experts. The serial killer is the Olympiad of the pathological liar.
The man's details joined hundreds more in the task force's files. A saliva swab would later be added. Still, girls continued to vanish.
And the list kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
By June 1983, at least 26 girls had disappeared.
They learn from their crimes. As their murders grow in number, their efficiency increases.
The remains were being found in secluded, quiet, dark areas.
That summer, 5 girls went missing.
By the time they're up to 5 or 6 or 10 homicides, they become very difficult to catch.
The fear was tremendous and deep throughout the entire community.
Autumn, 5 more vanished.
Some of them were in the mountain foothills, some of them were down in the Green River Valley.
He was, ahead of us. We wanted to catch him. We wanted to stop him.
Winter and spring 1984, 4 more girls gone.
There would be 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 in one spot.
Unbelievable.
He was outsmarting the homicide detectives. Everybody was looking for him.
He was dumping women like they were garbage. This was a gun site. It's not far from the airport. It's not far from the strip where the young girls were missing. In the evenings, it was dark, very secluded, very few people came down here. You could come, dump something, and be gone. And that's what happened in this location here. They were just dumped.
Among the dozens of bodies found was the 16-year-old Linda Jane Rule, her skeletal remains hidden under a bush. And in the scrubland south of the airport, the fate of the pregnant 18-year-old Mary Bridget Meehan was finally discovered.
Someone raped her, killed her, and buried her and her unborn baby in a shallow grave on the west side of the highway.
By spring 1984, the killer had amassed more than 40 victims. But then something changed.
The killings appeared to have stopped. Many thought that he was gone.
It's incredibly unusual for a serial killer simply to stop killing. A serial killer will usually only cease murder when he's apprehended or when he dies himself.
In 1985, the truck painter from the house in the quiet cul-de-sac began dating 40-year-old divorced mother, Judith.
When I first met him, I thought he was quite the gentleman and so polite and nice. He loved the country music and the dancing. And he was always smiling. He never got angry. And I just thought he was the greatest. It was like love at first sight.
Within months, the house became Judith's home.
He offered to help me move and that I could move in with him if I like. There was no carpet in his house, so he let me pick out some carpet. He had previous renters in there. And he had told me that the little one had wet on the carpet. The house needed a woman's touch.
After 3 years living together, the couple wed.
We were married in 1988. It seemed like the perfect marriage, and so he was good to my daughters, played with my grandchildren. My dreams are coming true.
Judith would enjoy 13 happy years of marriage, while most of the world forgot about the Green River Killer. Most, that is, except the men and women of the Green River Task Force. And in 2001, advances in DNA profiling enabled them to compare samples taken from the early victims, including Marcia Chapman, with swabs that had been taken from several men questioned during the investigation.
This is the DNA from Marcia Chapman, and this is the DNA from the Green River Killer. And we looked at them and we're like, they're the same. They're the same. It's Gary Ridgway.
I couldn't believe it. I was just devastated and in shock, and I think I went into denial. I wasn't believing it.
Only now would the world discover the shocking truth about Judith's husband, Gary Ridgway, the most prolific serial killer in US history. During the 1980s, the mysterious Green River Killer had prowled the red light district of Seattle's Strip unchecked, amassing a terrifying body count. In 2001, a DNA match had connected 52-year-old truck painter Gary Ridgway with the first few victims.
He'd been identified as the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States. Each of us recognized that this would be the biggest criminal case in the history of the state of Washington.
The prosecution and defense teams would now be able to interview the man suspected of over 4 dozen homicides.
I'm walking down a corridor and I'm going to open the door and be introduced to the supposed Green River Killer. 100 things are going through your mind and wondering, what is he going to be mean? Is he going to be crying? Is he going to be crazy? And I walked in and like, wow, this isn't what I expected.
How are you? Pretty good.
All of us kind of looked at each other and said, that's the guy that's been eluding everybody for 20 years?
What was remarkable was that he was so normal.
Sleep okay?
No.
Well, that didn't look like the Hilton in there. I got a glimpse of it.
Well, it had a posturepedic mattress in there, so it was here, so that was good.
Okay.
Yeah, a little bit hot in there, but...
If you did not know what he had done, you would like him. The monster within him was well hidden.
People want to ascribe extraordinary traits and qualities to these people. These are, for the most part, very ordinary individuals, except for the extraordinary crime that they get involved in.
So who was the suspected Green River Killer? Gary Ridgway was born in 1949, the middle of 3 boys. He lived in a small house, not far from the Strip.
His mom was kind of stay-at-home and then part-time. She worked at a department store. His dad drove a bus for the county.
Gary sometimes would ride with him on the bus, and his dad would say, see her, she's a prostitute, she's the scum of the earth, and would berate prostitutes and talk about how filthy and bad they were. And then there are a couple of episodes where Gary recalls him leaving him in the vehicle while Dad went and had sex with a prostitute.
School friend Terry Rochelle recalls that Gary Ridgway was more inward than his siblings.
His brother was very outgoing and, a bright personality, and Gary was more quiet and withdrawn, I would say is a good word. He was just a little pipsqueak guy, just, somebody's little brother, basically, you didn't pay a whole lot of attention to him. Just kind of in the shadows, I would say, most of his life.
At school, the struggling Ridgway failed to make an impression. However, at parents' evenings, his mother Mary did.
All the women kind of sat back and looked at her. It was strange because she would wear a big bouffant hairdo and lots of makeup, short skirts, which were not really the style in those days, especially for a mom. She just always seemed like she was trying to be very glamorous and not like our moms at all.
I always remember her wearing kind of the
really tight
shorts and low cut tops and longer hair. She was very attractive lady.
Ridgway admitted wetting the bed throughout his childhood and well into his teens.
When he would wet the bed, his mother would put him had him get in the bathtub and wash him and wash his genitals.
During one bath, her robe fell open and she was naked underneath, and he felt arousal at that, and at the same time knew that it probably wasn't a good thing to feel, but he felt it.
He talked about having some sexual feelings towards her. He described in some detail watching her when she was in a bathing suit and looking at her and thinking that she dressed pretty provocatively.
This overly sexualized person washing her son's genitals, and you realize that most teenage boys are having an awful time with dealing with their own emerging sexuality, has to have had an impact in some way.
Boys need to see their mothers as asexual. It is very, very destabilizing for an adolescent boy to see his mother in a sexual manner. It's very hard for an adolescent boy to imagine his mother having sex with anybody, including his father. And so when a mother behaves in a sexualized or hyper-sexualized way, it's very unsettling for an adolescent boy.
As Ridgway got older, he started showing signs of destructive behavior, starting fires, and as a teenager, he took his first step towards murder.
He approached a first grader, a 6-year-old boy that he saw playing in a lot near his house. The boy was dressed up playing cowboys and Indians, and he kind of lured him into the bushes and completely unprovoked stabbed the little boy in the stomach and nearly killed him. He told the boy that he just wanted to know what it felt like to kill somebody. And after he stabbed him, he took the knife and kind of wiped the blade off on the little boy's shoulder and, just walked away. And actually, nobody ever connected him to that.
Serial killers need to have some concrete proof of what they're doing. I mean, you can think about something, but until you've done it, you don't know how it's going to turn out. And so what the serial killer does is experiment. Often they will commit an act like a trial run.
Ridgway eventually finished school 2 years late due to his slow progress. The following year, age 21, he married his steady girlfriend and joined the Navy.
When he returned from his deployment to the Philippines, his wife admitted that she had had an affair with a friend of theirs. That was when he first started kind of referring to her as a whore and using other derogatory terms. And that was kind of the beginning of a series of relationships that never quite panned out for him.
During the early 1970s, Ridgway got a job spray painting at the Kenworth truck manufacturers. He then met and married his second wife.
He was very much into having sex, often, repeatedly, throughout the day, as frequently, pretty much as women would agree.
They would go out in the truck, and he loved to have sex in public where they could be discovered at any time.
But after having a child, their relationship deteriorated.
His wife left him when his son was about 5, and that really hurt him. And that was when he started to go frequent prostitutes.
Ridgway claimed he became addicted to prostitutes. He had in fact been quizzed by police about his activities on the Strip several times during the 80s, even passing a lie detector test when grilled about the Green River murders.
When your subject is someone without a conscience, who has no regrets and no remorse and no real concern, they can pass them.
He was a magnificent liar. He had an ability just to go and talk, and he would just talk and tell stories, and I you know, for a while I assumed they were true.
And when I would go in to visit Gary at the jail, he would tell me that everything's okay. He didn't do it. He didn't hurt those women. He didn't kill them. He didn't. And I would believe him.
As he was questioned in 2001, Ridgway continued to protest his innocence.
Up to this point, Gary had been maintaining that they had the wrong person, that he had had sex with many prostitutes, he hadn't killed any, and that was essentially going to be the defense.
But when forensic evidence surfaced, tying him to 3 more victims, Ridgway's story changed.
Myself and another attorney were in the meeting room waiting for Mr. Ridgway. I don't recall what we were talking about, but we both had smiles on our faces when he walked in. And he said, "Oh, you won't be smiling when we're done. I've been lying to you all. I've been manipulating everyone for all these years. I killed them all."
Only now would investigators discover the true shocking horror of the Green River Killer's crimes. In 2003, 54-year-old truck painter Gary Ridgway admitted he was the Green River Killer that had eluded capture for almost 2 decades. A man responsible for the murder of more than 4 dozen women. Faced with the death penalty, Ridgway offered to tell the truth about all his crimes in return for his life. On behalf of the victims' families, who wanted to know the fate of their loved ones, the prosecution agreed. Ridgway would now reveal the true horror of his crimes. Investigators now learned how the Green River Killer had so easily abducted and killed his victims, even at the height of the public terror.
He came across as being a very meek and mild, safe person. As a matter of fact, in one situation, he had his child in the car with him when he picked up a prostitute.
He looks like a mousy little man. He doesn't look like the kind of person that, if you were a prostitute, that you would be afraid of.
They thought, well, he's a family man, he's safe, and turns out he wasn't.
He preferred to take them to his house. Some said no to that, and they would drive to a remote location, and he had a pickup truck with a canopy on the back. And he would convince them to go into the back of the canopy so they could have more room to have sex. But what he would do is once he got them in the position, either in his bed at home, where he had pictures of his son on the wall and they felt a little more secure, or whether they were just hopping in the back of the truck, get naked, begin with oral sex. A missionary at some point convinced them that he would be able to finish sooner if they would agree to the rear entry position.
When I got through having a climax with her, I jumped on her.
He had his arm around the girl's neck.
How much are you pulling on her neck?
I'm pulling really hard on her neck.
How?
Just like this.
What are you saying to her?
Don't fight, and I'll let you go.
And then choke them with his forearm.
I'm feeling, I gotta kill her, I gotta kill her, I gotta kill her. You'll need to go up to kind of like on the top of the hill on this and pull in.
Ridgway guided the investigators to where he dumped dozens of young women.
I just drove in my pickup and camper and parked it, brought her body over and put it a little bit over the hill.
His method of recollection was where he had left their bodies.
Between this one and that one up there, you think you put like
five of them in there.
Okay.
He essentially said the victims didn't mean anything. I have no idea who they are. I don't know if they're black, if they're white, how old they are, how young they are. I mean, they really meant nothing to me as an individual.
What you're getting is what you're gonna get, and it's all you can get because I don't remember.
To every serial killer, human beings are objects. In the homicides that they commit, they're never going to remember the name. They're never going to remember the face. They'll remember the concrete action of where those bodies are.
One of the dump sites that Ridgway identified was that of Marie Malvar, the 18-year-old whose boyfriend had spotted Ridgway abducting her. He admitted that when he strangled her, she had fought back harder than any of his victims.
I put battery acid myself right here and there to cover up scratches. So there's a scratch here, scratches here from Milvar.
Ridgway claimed he was filled with rage and had wanted to hurt his victims even after their deaths. He admitted he'd tried to set the lifeless 16-year-old Linda Rule's hair on fire.
You know, he seemed throughout the interviews to try to blame a lot of what had happened on the women in his life. That the women that he actually killed were kind of an extension of all the women before who had disappointed him in some way.
All the pressure just built and built and built and built. My releasing point was killing women.
He did talk about a number of the victims that he would go back and have sexual relations with them for a number of days after he killed them.
Gary, did you revisit any of these?
I revisited at least one of them.
And when we say revisit, what did you come back to do?
Have sex with her.
He's like, oh yeah, you know, but then the flies would come and the maggots, and then I'd be like, oh, I don't, you know, like he didn't want to do it after that. You know, you were just, I mean, that's the thing. He said it in this, like I'm talking to you, but as if it's totally normal.
Now, why do individuals do this? The standard explanation for necrophilia had been sex with someone dead. You can have total control over it. There's no resistance at all. And so you can live out those sorts of feelings with a dead, lifeless body.
He's not the one that you're going to turn to and ask, why did you do this, and get the deep psychological answer. But one of the things that frequently came up was that he wouldn't have to pay for the sex.
Ridgway's murderous spree had continued unabated until he met his third wife, Judith, in the mid-80s.
Gary was so straight, normal, and loving and gentle. He was so kind around me all the time. He didn't get mad or upset about anything. It seemed like the perfect marriage.
When he first met her, he stopped patronizing prostitutes and stopped killing. And then, as he put it, he fell off the wagon.
Gary would call home and say that, you know, he's going to be late coming home, so he's going to grab a bite to eat, grab a hamburger, and, you know, he'll be late. When I think back now, that was probably one time when he was out picking up someone off of the Highway 99 strip.
And then he killed again.
Right in here's where I killed her. Right in here.
How far in?
20 feet.
He would tell me he'd call home and say he's going to stop at the junkyard on the way home from work. And then when he got home, he didn't really have any parts from the, so that may have been another occasion.
And so, after having killed maybe 60 girls from 82 to 85, from 85 to when he was caught in 2001, the number of victims was more like 10 or 11.
Mr. Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 1?
Guilty.
In 2003, Gary Ridgway made his plea to the 48 charges of murder that investigators could conclusively tie him to.
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 5?
Guilty.
When he confessed, and when I sat and listened to him say guilty.
Mr. Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree for the death of Marcia Chapman?
Guilty.
After every one of the names that they had said.
For the death of Mary B. Meehan?
Guilty.
I just sat there and cried, and that's when it finally sunk in that this is real. He did it. There's someone else inside of him when he went through the door and left to go to work. He wasn't the man that I knew.
Count 19 for the death of Linda Rule.
Guilty.
I would think back and think about all those years that I was with him. Were they real? Or was he just using me?
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 48?
Guilty.
I lived with him all those years. He could have killed me. He could have killed my daughters. He could have killed my grandbabies.
So what made the monster? Was it his unusual upbringing? Or was Gary Ridgway born to kill?
I still don't believe that any child is born to kill, but I think some children have a predisposition to violence. If the child grows up in a safe place for them, where they feel loved, where they attach, we're never going to know that that predisposition for violence is there. But if that child is born into a home where they're afraid, where they're neglected, where they're abused, then you have the perfect soil to grow a serial killer.
I think that a boy and his mother have a certain relationship, and when that relationship is different, then I think that's when we start seeing those kind of switches turning on and off.
This is one of my ominous signs. She was somewhat seductive and so on. These sorts of unhealthy relationships with a maternal figure.
People that I've encountered that I've prosecuted for murder, I think that their circumstances have driven them to do what they have done in the majority of cases that I have handled, I would say. I did not see that in Ridgway. I truly believed that he was born that way, hardwired that way, whatever you want to say.
The Green River Killer was definitely born to kill. He was an individual who has this changed gene and culminated in a tremendous number and intensity of homicides.
His brain is definitely wired differently. He's a psychopath. That has to be a brain miswiring from the beginning.
I don't know about the nurture-nature piece. I think at some point it's a decision. And I think we all have some propensities for violence, but you can decide, you can control it. And he decided how he wanted to control it.
19 years after Marsha Chapman's body was discovered beneath the surface of the Green River, Gary Ridgway was sentenced to serve 48 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole.
In the end, Marsha got her justice because it was DNA found on her that they could match with Gary Ridgway. And Marsha got her day.
That was a good day. It was a good day.
Before Ridgway was led away, Judge Richard Jones instructed him to face the victims' families.
There's a tremendous amount of emotion that these family members wanted to pour out for Gary Ridgway to hear.
I can only hope someone gets the opportunity to choke you unconscious so you can live through the horror that you put our daughters, our sisters, our mothers through.
The pain would not go away, but it brought them closure.
The one thing that I want you, Gary Ridgway, to know, I was that daughter at home, waiting for my mom to come home.
I think for all of us, as we brought the families up and introduced them, it was really emotional.
I recall Linda Rule's father.
There are people here that hate you. I'm not one of them.
Was very sympathetic, very compassionate individual.
What God says to do, and that's to forgive all. So you are forgiven, sir.
On one hand, I'm sitting next to a person who's done the most inhumane things to other human beings, and then 15 feet away is a person doing the most humane and merciful thing.
I wanted him to look out, see the pain, see the anger, and see all the agony that he'd caused in his lifetime. I wanted him to take that visual image with him back to prison. So for the balance of his life, that would be the last public image that he had.
You took from me my firstborn child. May her soul and the soul of the other 47 victims rest in peace.
"5'4", Donald Wee Gaskins would earn himself the title the meanest man in America.
If you had a business dispute, you'd sue him. Pee-wee'd kill him.
A serial killer who, if he's to be believed, was responsible for over 100 cruel and sickening murders.
Right over here is where he drowned Doreen, and then he hit the baby in the back of the head and hatchet after he had raped her. The total amount is 105 people.
A man who wouldn't stop killing, even on death row.
When he plugs that son of a bitch up, it'll blow him on into hell.
It was just kind of astonishing that all that was able to happen in the penitentiary.
So what made Pee Wee the man he was? And was he born to kill?
My daddy, he called himself a vampire. He would have to see blood.
1975. Schoolteacher Mary Ann Dunham reports the disappearance of one of her students, 13-year-old Kim Gaskins.
Kim was in a class of fifth graders, most of whom were 10 or 11 years old, but she was 13, as I recall. She was quiet, petite. Her mother had died, I think, the previous spring. I think she was lonely for her mother and sad, you know, so she was looking for somebody to pay attention to her. Often at the beginning of the school year, teachers want to assess their class writing skills, and so sometimes you'll assign them to write about what they did on their summer vacation or whatever. And that particular year, I remember asking my children to write about the person they admired most. And Kim wrote about someone who was named Donna Gaskins.
Donna Gaskins was the common-law wife of a colourful local criminal, Donald Wee Gaskins.
Pee Wee has always been known as a notorious person in our area. I think you would have to say he came over as different, because how many people do you know that drive a hearse for their vehicle?
It was a long black hearse, just, you know, like they used to, you know, drive a long time ago. And on the very back, he had a little sign that says, "I haul dead bodies." Everybody joked about it, you know, everybody just, you know, thought it was funny.
He always told people that he hauled bodies in it, but people didn't pay much attention to him. But while they didn't pay attention to him, they were still scared of him in the lower end of the county. Everybody, if you talked about Pee Wee, they sort of would run and hide because they were just scared of him. He had that kind of reputation.
Gaskins' daughter, Shirley, remembers the day Kim Gaskins vanished.
Her mom had died, and she got to be friends with Daddy because Daddy was living in Charleston. She was a sweet little girl. We had just come back from the park, and my mother-in-law lived next door, and the children was going to go over there to get something to eat. So I said, well, go on over there, and I'll be there in a minute. And when I went over there, I said, where's Kim? Nobody had seen Kim. And she just walked out the door and disappeared. And Daddy said, well, you know, don't worry about it. She probably run away.
Kim was not the only missing person. 5 years earlier, in 1970, Shirley's cousin, Janice Kirby, had vanished.
Janice and I mean, when we were little, we did everything together. She was a sweet girl, very smart girl, very good in school. I mean, and she was just, you know, all-American country girl. When she first disappeared, everybody said that, you know, she'd run away from home. We were all out looking for her, you know, searching for her. Everybody was calling everybody that they knew to, you know, try to find her. But, you know, after 6, 7 months, we knew something wasn't right.
Now, detectives investigating the new disappearance began to focus on Shirley's father, Donald Wee Gaskins.
Some of our field agents were working on rumors that had been surfacing, working along with detectives from Charleston in an attempt to find Kim Gaskins.
We started looking for the Gaskins girl, and of course we did not have Pee Wee at the time, but we did have an individual who was running with Pee Wee at the time. We did pick Walter Neely up, and after a lot of talking and everything, Walter finally took the investigators out and showed them where he had helped Pee Wee bury someone.
They knew somebody was buried there. We didn't have any idea what we were going to find until we started digging.
We took probably, I guess, 10 or 12, 15 deputies and sled agents, and we just lined up and started walking slowly into the woods. Sometime during that process, in moving through the bushes, the undergrowth, somebody discovered that there were some bushes that had been put there that weren't growing there. We had metal probes that were maybe 3 feet long with a T-handle on top, a piece of rebar with a point on it, that you could determine soil consistency. You probe along, and then it goes down.
They probed around enough to where they could tell that there was someone buried there. So we sealed the area off and started digging. And it turned up that we found 6 bodies buried there. Yeah, it was a pretty gruesome scene. I guess I was overwhelmed because, you know, I had been in law enforcement for some 12 and a half years prior to this, and I'd never seen anything of that magnitude.
But the discovery of the 6 bodies was just the beginning of a shocking tale that would lead to claims that Gaskins was the most prolific serial killer in US history. In 1975, the disappearance of 13-year-old schoolgirl Kim Gaskins had led detectives to a burial site in the woods of South Carolina. There, investigators, including Sheriff William Barnes,
It would have been right there by that tree. That's where it would have been.
would make a shocking discovery.
This is the area where the 6 bodies were recovered. I have not been back here since everything happened back in 1976. The graves would have all been within probably 25 foot of each other. They would have all been right in this area here where we're standing now, under this tree.
All 6 had been murdered and buried 2 apiece in 3 shallow graves. And all 6 were linked to notorious character Donald Wee Gaskins, a diminutive local car thief who drove an old hearse and boasted of having his own private cemetery. No one had believed him.
I was 6 months pregnant at the time with my last child, and we were, you know, when the cops came up there, and, you know, they were telling me, oh, you know, that they were looking for my daddy for murder and stuff like that. I mean, I went in shock. I went into labor. My baby was born. I wasn't even 7 months pregnant. She didn't weigh, but she weighed 2 pounds and something.
All of a sudden, we found ourselves in the national limelight.
I was one of the first reporters on the scene, and I got a lot of it firsthand, and it was just, to me, it was so shocking. You know that's pretty wild, and that's hard to believe in South Carolina. You don't find stuff like that around here.
Investigators now had to uncover the identity of the victims.
The ones we initially found were in very good condition. Apparently they'd been putting the ground in a cold time of the year, so that adipocia had occurred where the fatty tissue sort of turns to like a soap-like material that's firmer and keeps the shape and consistency of the skin and the underlying tissue.
I've never been a smoker, but the smell of decaying flesh was so intense in that area that the smoke from the cigars diminished that smell enough to where you could stand it.
In the first grave were 25-year-old Dennis Bellamy and his 15-year-old half-brother, Johnny Knight. Both had been involved in an auto theft ring with Gaskins.
Daddy said they were going to steal a car, and they came by the house, and I had just cooked some biscuit and coffee, and they ate some biscuit and coffee, and they left, and I never seen them again.
We took them down into the woods and went to a big oak tree and sort of pointed up in the tree and was telling them how they could use that to throw a chain horse over to pull engines out of the car and dispose of stolen property. This would be the tree where he brought the two fellows out and pointed up to the limb, talking about how they could horse the motors out of stolen vehicles here. As they were looking up in the tree, he shot one of them in the back of the head, and then when the other one ran, he shot him. This is where he shot him, right here.
If he'd think that they were gonna, they were getting tired or they was gonna tell on him, then he'd get rid of them.
The other 4 victims, 2 men and 2 women, were all people Gaskins thought had wronged him or might betray him. But none of the 6 bodies found was that of missing schoolgirl Kim Gaskins. Gaskins was arrested trying to flee the area. Faced with the prospect of the death penalty for his crimes, he struck a deal to lead investigators to further bodies. At an area known as Alligator Landing, he admitted to burying 23-year-old family friend Doreen Dempsey and her 2-year-old daughter, Robin.
Doreen Dempsey and Robin were both skeletonized because they were very close to the surface. They were not really buried deeply. That child had some injuries to the head that we felt were probably pre-mortem.
Right here is where my daddy used to live, and right over here is where he drowned Doreen, just held her under the water until she had drowned it. And then he hit the baby in the back of the head and hatchet after he had raped her. He said that he just could not resist raping the baby. He said he just couldn't resist it.
You see this hole here, stump hole? That's an example. Something like that, he just stuffed the body down in that hole. Just a small child. The reason he killed them is because the mother had been with a black man and the baby was half black and half white, and he just didn't believe in that. And that was his reason for doing away with them.
Eventually, Gaskins would reveal the truth about the disappearance of schoolgirl Kim Gaskins.
Kim was buried almost in our backyard. Right out in here is where they found Kim Gaskins. She walked out my front door, and I never seen her again. He took her off from the house and killed her.
"8 years after he had killed her, Gaskins finally gave up the body of his niece, 15-year-old Janice Kirby.
This is the grave site where his niece, Janice Kirby, was buried. He killed her in 1970, and her body was recovered in 1978. Dealing with a child or a small kid, that's tough to take. It's hard not to get involved. Just a little girl here. She's just a young teenager, really. Life snuffed out, stuck in a hole in the woods. Nobody knew where she was, what happened to her.
Investigators would ultimately discover the remains of 13 victims. A body count that made Wee Gaskins the biggest mass murderer in the history of South Carolina. But in prison, Gaskins would make an even more shocking claim.
I just shivered. I mean, I said, Daddy, I don't want to hear this. And he would say, Half Pint, I need to get it off my chest. I need to tell somebody.
Gaskins is going to claim that he murdered some 80 to 90 young people, torturing them, then prolonging their death, torturing them again, and then hiding their bodies.
He allegedly started in 1969, killing young women primarily, later young boys and young women, along the coast.
He used to travel up and down the road and pick up hitchhikers, and he would torture them.
He always talked about dumping their nude bodies into marsh areas and sinking them deep enough so that it'd be unlikely for people to be able to find them.
Gaskins, if we take his word seriously, is clearly a process-focused serial killer. He's someone who wants to be with the victim to experience the terror that the victim is experiencing for as long as possible. Gaskins, for example, would often describe going into a hardware store and eyeing up particular tools that he felt he would be able to torture his victims with for longer. We're dealing with a very, very cunning predator who is quite clearly also a sexual sadist and a psychopath.
He alleged that he did 10 or 12 a year. Practically every month he'd kill somebody along the beach.
He said every so often he would get this urge that he would have to see blood. He called himself a vampire. He said his stomach would get to hurting. He said he would just get tied up in knots. He said he just couldn't be still. He would just tremble all over, and it would not stop until he killed somebody.
Serial murderers will tell you that there is something inside of them that they have to go kill. And that's common among serial murderers. It's almost like somebody who's almost so anxious that if they don't do something, they're going to break into a billion pieces. It's a little scary to say that a serial murderer is an addict, but if you really look at it in that context, in a way they are an addict. They have to do it. They have to do it.
Donald Wee Gaskins wouldn't even let being in maximum security prison prevent him from taking human life. In 1982, he would plan a murder that was thought to be impossible. No one had believed hearse-driving criminal Donald Wee Gaskins when he'd boasted of having his own private cemetery in rural South Carolina. But in the 1970s, detectives had been led to the graves of 13 of his victims, and Gaskins would claim there were more than 90 others still undiscovered. So who was Wee Gaskins?
Most of my family was good Christian people. I mean, my daddy's the only person I know in my family that ever got in any trouble. He did enough for everybody.
Donald Gaskins Jr. was born on March the 13th, 1933, to an unmarried mother.
My daddy was a bad boy when he was little. My grandma said he was always doing something he wasn't supposed to do. And, you know, he used to get a whipping a lot. But, you know, my grandma was a very good woman. She was very good to him. But her brothers was a little bit hard on him. They used to beat him a lot because he wouldn't listen.
Gaskins' childhood was punctuated by a series of stepfathers in his life. He never knew his own father, and his mother had a series of relationships. Gaskins' childhood was also characterized by physical abuse, both at home and especially at school.
Gaskins was a peewee. He was a small guy, and so many individuals who live that lifestyle and that culture have to compensate for their small stature and overcompensate by trying to demonstrate how tough he is, how aggressive he is, to gain a reputation. And Gaskins was pretty good at that.
Gaskins dropped out of school at 11, forming a gang with 2 friends. Together, they dubbed themselves the Trouble Trio.
What they would do would be burglarize places, assault people, they would rob.
Here we've got a boy who is clearly what criminologists would call being involved in differential association. In other words, he's going to gain status, not through having peers who are going to do well at school, but instead he's going to gain status through associating with boys through committing crime. Initially petty crime, but that would degenerate. Gaskins would eventually commit a sexual offense, a rape.
I know Daddy and his 2 friends, they raped one of the boys' sisters.
Together, the Trouble Trio had lured the girl to their hideout and taken it in turns to rape her.
They used to, you know, get together and do all, you know, do all kind of mean things together.
In 1946, aged just 13, Gaskins would graduate from rape to attempted murder. Whilst burglarizing a house, Gaskins was disturbed by a young girl.
He hit her in the head with an axe and left her on the ditch bank, thinking she was dead.
The only thing that kept her alive was there was a little bit of water trickling through there, and it kept her alive till someone found her, or she would have died.
The girl was able to identify her attacker. The juvenile Pee-wee was sent to reform school until his 18th birthday.
In our area, the industrial school for boys was a place where kids who got in trouble, they went and they made them work on the farm and this sort of stuff. I don't think they mistreated them, but they made them work hard.
The diminutive Gaskins claimed that on his 2nd night in custody, he was ambushed in the showers and gang raped by 20 boys. He would have to accept the protection of the dormitory's boss boy in return for sexual services.
Daddy was a really tiny, tiny person. And, you know, the bigger boys peeked on him.
You've always got bullies everywhere.
Well, what often happens, as often happens in prison settings, is that you're put in with a group of individuals who are generally worse than you are. Very frequently, they were quite brutal.
Over the next 4 years, Gaskins would run away repeatedly. But in 1950, he was due for release.
I'm holding in my hands a report, February 28, 1950. It says, Dear Dr. Odom, the subject was committed to this institution on June 18, 1946 by the Court of General Sessions, the Criminal Court of Florence County, under an indictment for assault and battery with intent to kill. We are not attempting any diagnosis, but we are sure from our dealings with abnormal delinquents that this boy is antisocial and there's something in his past development that is preying upon his mind. We consider him dangerous and also believe he has the homicidal tendencies peculiar to a paranoid type. We are requesting psychiatric treatment and requesting proper placement in view of the fact that we have been unable to adjust this boy to our group.
On his 18th birthday, Donald Wee Gaskins was set free. His criminal activities took up where he'd left off.
When he got out of reform school, he got a job working for a tobacco farmer. And what he would do would be to steal the tobacco and sell it. And then he set fire to the barn to cover up the theft.
After just 1 year as a free man, Gaskins is teased by a teenage girl and strikes out.
All through his life, you can see that Gaskins is particularly angry at women. Now, perhaps we can date that back to the fact that his mother was a single mother, that Gaskins never knew his father, that there were multiple stepfathers. But for whatever reasons, Gaskins shows throughout his life a great deal of hostility towards girls and towards women. And this poor girl who taunts Gaskins about burning down the barns sees his wrath and has her skull opened up by Gaskins hitting her with a hammer.
Gaskins is convicted of arson, assault with a deadly weapon, and attempted murder, and sent to the state penitentiary. Here, a group of feared convicts, known as power men, made the rules. Gaskins was chosen by one such violent convict as a sex slave.
And Gaskins realizes that if he wants to avoid being sexually abused for the length of his sentence, he too has to become a power man.
Gaskins approached the most feared power man in the prison and slit his throat.
In the rules of that particular jail, he's elevated to the top, he becomes a face within that particular penal subculture, and he serves the rest of his time with notoriety, someone not to be messed with. And that really, I think, is the beginnings of Gaskin overcoming these childhood problems about his size and actually using the fact that he's small but dangerous to his own advantage.
When he got older and, had guns and stuff, he figured, hey, I can be a big man now.
Gaskins would spend the next 2 decades in and out of prison, frequently escaping and being recaptured.
These woods out here is where my daddy would always run. All these woods connect in some way. And he'd stay out here for months at a time when he'd escape from prison. Eating snakes, he'd eat rattlesnake. He would take water out of ditches and stuff and boil it and drink it.
He was up in the courthouse, in the old courthouse for trial, and they put him in the waiting room, and while he was in there, he pushed the window up and jumped out the second story window and escaped. He went into the swamp, and they put the bloodhounds on his trail, and a couple of the deputies back then took a little nap while they were waiting on him, and they woke up and found that he had written on the back of the windshield that Pee Wee was here in the dew.
You could hide out for a long, long time out here. And people scared out here because of the snake infestation. They didn't scare him. Daddy said he used to sleep with the snakes.
During his times out of prison, Gaskins would frequently take up with a new wife.
Here you see in these multiple sexual partners that Gaskins pursues, normally younger women, you begin to see some of the psychopathy in Gaskins' character emerging. He's the classic psychopath who will use women as opposed to forming serious relationships with women. And partly that's about reflecting his hatred of women.
Then in 1970, the disappearances began.
He kept bringing people to my house, and he would say, Well, he called me Half Pint. He said, Half Pint. He said, will you fix this one so-and-so something to eat? And I would do it, but you know, they would leave and never come back. I would never see them again. He came home a couple of times with blood on his hands. And, you know, I'd ask him, he said, well, I hit a deer or something like that. But people started missing, you know, and not coming back. And I knew something. I knew something was wrong.
By the end of the 70s, Gaskins had been tied to 13 murders and was in maximum security prison serving life. But in 1982, he determined to add to his total, planning a murder on death row that most thought impossible. In 1982, serial killer Donald Wee Gaskins, while serving a life sentence in South Carolina's maximum security prison, set his sights on another victim.
The final murder that Gaskins commits, he commits in the most extraordinary circumstances.
His target, a fellow inmate housed in solitary confinement on death row.
Rudolph Tyner was semi-retarded. I mean, very low IQ guy from New York. He was passing through South Carolina when he and some others decided to rob the Moons. They had a convenience store down on the coast.
He had already left the store, turned around and went back in the store and shot them both each in the head with a sawed-off shotgun.
The deceased couple's son, Tony Simo, wanted justice.
Tony Simo, he was the adopted son of these folks. They treated him great. He was very emotional about this.
Although sentenced to death, Tyner had avoided execution for years.
There were some procedural problems. Simo, the son, after I think it'd been 6 or 7 years, just lost patience. And he'd been sentenced to death twice. Time to get on with it.
Tony was friends with someone in prison. They got Daddy and Tony together.
Sammy, can I help you? Operator, it's Collector Tony. My name is Gerald McCormick.
Thank you.
Hello?
I have a phone call to Tony from Joe McCormick. Will you accept?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Are you Tony?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Tony? Yeah. Gerald wanted me to call you. Said, tell you this is the doctor calling you.
The Moon's son and stepson hired Pee Wee to kill Rudolph Tyner.
Tyner was housed in solitary confinement in the state's most secure prison.
I went to the authorities and I told them that Daddy was planning on, you know, killing someone in there, and they told me there was no way that he could do it, that, you know, it was impossible.
Initially, he befriended Tyner and took him food and marijuana and whatever he wanted. And they smuggled in some poison. It didn't work, made him sick.
We give that son of a bitch all of it but one dose, and all it is doing is making that son of a bitch sick. We put it in some damn book for him to drink the other night, and he drank, and 2 more drank, and all it was made all 3 of them sick as hell.
With poison not working, Wee Gaskins comes up with an ingenious plan to end the life of Rudolph Tyner.
They had made him a maintenance man with all the tools he wanted.
And the back of his cell backed up to Tyner's cell.
Gaskins suggests to Tyner that he wants to have a communication system between their cells, almost like a telephone system.
I come up with something, there can't be no damn making sick on it. I need 1 electric cap and as much of a stick of damn dynamite as you can get. Okay, well, I'll probably get at least plastic explosion. Well, that'd be good.
This is an actual cup that they used in the Department of Corrections at the time. They had this size and they had a bigger size. Pee Wee took one of these and melted a hole in the bottom of it with a soldering iron and put in a female plug, like you'd plug in headphones, for instance. On the other end of that, he attached the blasting cap, nestled it in the C4 explosive.
Was able to feed it through the wall, through the vent into Tyner, and under the guise of it being an intercom type system.
I'll take a damn radio and rig it into a bomb, and when he plugs that son of a bitch up, it'll blow him on into hell.
He told Tyner to, asked him if he could hear him, hold it up to his ear, and then he plugged the other end into the 110 socket.
Just listen for the bang.
Pieces of him were blown all over the prison. Fingers went everywhere. Pee Wee then pulled the wire back through the vent, clipped it up, flushed it down the toilet, and came out. And what's going on?
I mean, it was just kind of astonishing that all that was able to happen in the penitentiary. The only good thing about that was that, you know, that was a crime that he could get the death penalty for at that time.
Pee Wee had recorded his phone calls with Tony Simo, planning to later blackmail him. But investigators discovered the tapes, and Pee Wee was convicted of Tyner's murder and sentenced to death. So was Donald Pee Wee Gaskins a born killer?
This is a 1964 report when he's again committed on another crime, and they talked to his mother. The patient's mother said the patient did have a lot of physical difficulties as a young child. When he was about a year old, he drank some kerosene and almost died. The doctor who treated him said his nerves would be bad for the rest of his life. After this incident, the patient began to have convulsions and would remain unconscious for as long as 10 minutes at a time. Ms. Hannah said the patient had convulsions until he was about 3 years old. He had bad dreams, often wake up in the middle of the night and be afraid. Ms. Hannah said she had to sleep with him until he was about 13 years old. His mother thinks that kerosene drinking early on was the cause of his problems. I don't know.
It's become a very popular thing to talk about how concussions can change personalities and can change people's behavior, can make them more aggressive and more assertive. But if it were true that brain trauma had something to do with aggression, we would expect that every serial murderer would have had some type of brain trauma or brain insult, and that doesn't happen.
Gaskins is an individual who's had an antisocial life since he was a child. He began with some sort of a small gang that did all sorts of antisocial and criminal sorts of things. And he's very, very comfortable not only with committing crime, but with killing. It means absolutely nothing to him.
The pattern of Gaskins' life has been of a boy who learned how to commit crime and to commit more sophisticated crimes. It's the pattern of a life whereby a boy learns how to be a power man by using violence to ensure that he gets his way in the world. But that doesn't mean to say that I think that Gaskins was born to kill. This is somebody who was socialized into killing.
Whatever gene there is in a human being that gives them compassion, he lacked.
A lot of people says my daddy didn't have a conscience, that he could not regret what he had done. So, I mean, I don't know, but he never said he was sorry that he killed anybody. I think he was born to kill. I really do. I think my daddy was sick. I think my daddy had a split personality. My daddy always, I mean, ever since I can remember, always loved to kill something.
Gaskins would go to the electric chair, professing to be the single most prolific serial killer in American history. But did the 80 to 90 young hitchhikers he claimed to have killed along the coast actually exist?
The coastal killings, I personally don't believe any of that's true. We've never had any physical evidence or rumor or conjecture from anybody that, you know, my niece or my nephew or any of my kin people are missing, been missing for so long, and then last seen with Pee Wee, like we have with some of the others, I don't believe that happened.
If there had been any more victims, he would have called me and tried to work out a deal to where, you know, he wanted to go out and look for a body and show us a body, and there just wasn't anything there for it.
It's amazing. It's extremely difficult to weight a body down with enough weight for it not to bloat as it decomposes and float up. But now, in the areas he's talking about putting them, it certainly could have floated up, decomposed the rest of the way, become skeletonized, and sink back down. And so it's certainly possible that it would not be seen.
Without corroboration. Could he have killed 100 people? Sure, he could have. But he would be an outlier. That's a very, very high number of victims, even for a prolific serial killer. But since he is so inadequate and has to compensate constantly his entire life, to lie and exaggerate your killings wouldn't surprise me at all. That would be very consistent with his personality. It's possible, but not probable.
Everything my daddy said was true. I could tell when my daddy was telling a lie. I could tell. There's something about his face that I could tell. The total amount is 105 people.
He wanted just to be notorious. He wanted people to think he was the baddest thing ever to live in South Carolina. I think he was pretty close to the top.
This is where my daddy's ashes is scattered right here. He wanted me to put him here because this was his old stomping ground, and we couldn't bury him because people was trying to steal his body because they said that he was the devil's son, and they wanted to worship it. He's in right in here, right in here. I mean, I'll always love my dad. I mean, he was my dad. You know, that's something you can't change, and you can't stop love. If you love somebody, you love them, and you know, I love my daddy. No matter what he done, and I didn't agree with him because I testified against him, I'll always love my daddy.
I can't understand you. I ask you to start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go, sit, pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must see thousands of movies. You must know what it's like. They're training chimpanzees at Cape Canaveral to operate a camera. Anybody can do it.
These are the home movies of a murderer.
Can you go back a bit? I mean, you're far too near.
A man who in the 1980s would be uncovered as the most prolific serial killer in British history.
And you ain't seen nothing yet.
A civil servant whose extraordinary behavior would see him named with cruel irony, the kindly killer.
Batteries had run out. That's why the camera went up the creek. Okay, fair enough. You think you know how to use it? All you do is point it down and press a button.
But was this murderer of young men driven by nature or nurture? Was the kindly killer born to kill?
Cut.
In the early winter of 1983, we had a problem arise in the Muswell Hill area of London. It was initiated by us receiving a call for a block toilet.
Number 23, Cranley Gardens, had been split into flats and bedsits. The residents had experienced problems with the plumbing for days.
An engineer at the time went to attend the block toilet, cleared the toilet, but did remark to us afterwards that he'd never smelt such a bad smell in an apartment before in his life.
Still, lavatories at the property continued to block.
A plumber was sent around very urgently on Saturday morning, and he looked down in the drains beneath the house, and he saw what he knew was not what should be there.
He observed what he said looked like some butcher's prepared meat and a few bones.
He discovered that what was blocking the toilets was actually human flesh.
On the 9th of February 1983, sitting in my office, minding my own business, and suddenly got a phone call from Peter Slade, who was the early turn uniform inspector, and he asked me if I'd go up to Cranley Gardens. He had a bit of a problem up there, and I just got into the CID car and drove up there. I always remember it was bitterly cold. It had been snowing, and we stood outside this awful house and looked down the pit where the drains were, and he showed me 4 little pieces of flesh, each about 3 inches by half an inch, maybe an inch, and also 3 bones with a knuckle at each end. And my first thought when I saw them was that they were from a human hand. The drains were blocked over halfway up the building, so we knew that the blockage was originating from the very top.
The tenant of the top flat was a 37-year-old executive officer at a nearby job centre, Dennis Andrew Nilsen. He was due to return from work at 5:30.
When my 2 colleagues and I walked up to the front door of the place in order to wait for him inside, we had no idea what we were going to find. We knew we had a killer, but we didn't know what he'd done. Nilsen walked in, bang on cue at 5:30, and leading up to that, I had been thinking for 2 or 3 hours about what I was going to face. I knew that for someone to have flushed a dead body down the loo in small pieces, it was going to be somebody a little bit different. When Nilsen came in through that front door, I'd already made a decision to be very light-hearted with him. And I remember saying to him, "Mr. Nilsen," and he said, "Yes, that's me." And I said, "I'm Detective Chief Inspector J. I've come about your drains." And a little smile came across his face, and he said, "Well, since when have police been interested in blocked drains?" And I said to him, "Well, you take me up in your flat and I'll tell you all about it." The first thing that caught me was the smell of decomposing flesh. I said to him, "I'm here because your drains were blocked with human remains." And he said, "Oh my God, how awful." And I just got a little bit closer to him, face to face, looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Don't mess me about. Where's the rest of the body?" And he just paused momentarily and he said, "In plastic bags in the other room."
Nilsen was immediately arrested and taken to the station for questioning.
My deputy, Detective Inspector Steve McCusker, sat in the back of the police car and I drove. And I don't know what prompted Steve to do this, but he suddenly said to Nilsen, "Are we talking about 1 body here or maybe 2? And Nilsen said neither. He said, "I think it's 16. Well, I can remember the steering wheel in the car sort of shaking in my hands.
The police hardly could believe their ears because this was all said in a very matter-of-fact voice, very dispassionate. Why dispassionate? Because this is a man without passion. His only passion came when he was in a murderous impulse, when he was overtaken by the other self.
In Nilsen's wardrobes were 2 black plastic bags and several air fresheners. The bags contained dismembered body parts and 2 severed heads. In a tea chest was found another torso, bones and a skull. Under a drawer in the bathroom were legs and a pelvis. It constituted the remains of 3 men. In the garden of an address in Cricklewood, investigators would identify the fragmented remains of at least 8 more.
He told me off the record that if it hadn't have been 15, it would have been 150 if we hadn't caught him when we did, because there was no stopping. The whole thing was just totally bizarre.
Dennis Nilsen was born in 1945 in Fraserburgh, a remote fishing community in northeast Scotland. His mother's family had lived there for generations. His father was a visiting Norwegian soldier.
He was one of 3 children, the middle child. He had an older brother, a younger sister. He never really knew his father.
Nilsen, as a child, was a bit of a loner.
He didn't really have friends because everybody thought he was a bit odd. His mother said she could never cuddle him. He didn't have tactile relationships with anyone except his grandfather.
Nilsen's father is absent from the household, and so he had formed a bond with his grandfather. They would walk together, fish together, and so forth.
The boy's grandfather would often be away for weeks at a time, trawling the fishing grounds of the North Sea.
One day, he came home from school, and his mother said to him, "Oh, do you want to see your granddad?" He said, oh, he didn't know he was there even. So he was very pleased about that, and he went into the kitchen, and there on the kitchen table was a long box, and in it was his grandfather. Nobody had prepared him for the fact that he was dead.
Nilsen's grandfather had died at sea, and his corpse had been brought home for burial.
He had this picture in his mind imprinted of seeing his grandfather white as a sheet, and I think that affected him deeply.
Nilsen would later say that when he saw his grandfather laid out in the front sitting room after his grandfather's death, that this was when Nilsen first began to associate love with death, an inert body.
From that moment, I'm convinced, I can't prove it, but I'm convinced that his idea of love and his idea of death fused and became linked, inextricably linked. When his mother said to him, "Your granddad's gone to a better place," he, the little boy, aged 6, thought, well, if he's gone to a better place, why didn't he take me with him? He would sometimes even go out into the sea and simulate drowning as a means of being with him.
Aged 15, Nilsen would leave his home behind.
Nilsen would join the army. Specifically, he joined the catering corps, which is, of course, where he'd learned his butchering skills. Skills that were going to be put to use in a different context when he's back in civilian life.
In 1983, the discovery of human flesh blocking the drains at 23 Cranley Gardens had led to the arrest of civil servant Dennis Nilsen. He claimed to have taken the lives of at least 15 young men. Investigators learned that he'd had a lonely childhood, punctuated by the death of a beloved grandfather. At 15 years old, he joined the Army Catering Corps. Early on, the young Nilsen would stand out from his fellow new recruits.
He was quite argumentative in as much as not picking an argument in a nasty sort of way, but if you said that photograph is black and white, you'd know he was saying it was white and black. and so forth. He was quite contrary as a person, really. We used to sit listening to the Beatles, Rolling Stones. We'd read the Parade magazines, which are like girly magazines of the day, and he'd probably be reading broadsheets. And he'd also listen to classical music. I remember there was once a scrap in the barrack room, and I think he scratched and slapped. He didn't thump like the rest of us. I remember somebody saying, "Oh, Nilsen, you're weird."
The teenage Nilsen harboured a secret.
What's interesting about the army experience is that it would have been impossible for Nilsen to have shared the fact that he was gay with any of his colleagues.
Basically, they just didn't accept homosexuals at all. So if somebody was gay, they'd keep very, very quiet about it.
During his time in the army, Nilsen began a lifelong interest in photography.
He maintained it was his hobby, photography, but it was much more important than a hobby. It was self-realization. He used to get his colleagues in the army to pretend that they were corpses, as if they'd been slain in battle, and he would take photographs of that. They thought this was a bit odd, but they went along with it.
Nilsen would spend 11 years in the Armed Forces Catering Corps, rising to the rank of corporal.
I think he was a bit of a bully underneath, but with his rank, you know, once he was in charge of a room sort of thing, I think he tended to bully a bit.
But just before his 27th birthday, Nilsen would reject the familiarity and order of army life and strike out on his own. In 1970s London, he found a thriving gay scene.
He's living in a large urban metropolitan area where clearly there are gay pubs that he would be able to visit for the first time.
People were more friendlier back then. People were very chatty, and life in London was exciting at that time. He wasn't a bad-looking man, and he seemed quite educated, quite good to talk to.
He chooses his words well, fluently, but after a few minutes you'd realize that he's not talking to you or with you, but he's talking to himself, because he doesn't pay attention to anything except what he himself is saying.
What are you doing switching the bloody thing on and off for? You'd never make a cameraman, you know. No. I'm not going to do anything pornographic.
Nilsen joined the Metropolitan Police.
This is not unusual for these individuals to seek out a profession of authority, whether it's a police officer or some other civil servant type job where they could have control over someone else. This is what is so stimulating to them.
He's living a double life. He's living a life of the police constable, but at the same time, he's also living a double life, talking about being able to express his sexuality. And of course, that inevitably would lead to conflict.
After 11 months, Nilsen tired of the police and quit. He was also becoming disillusioned with the transient nature of the gay scene and began to seek more permanent companionship.
What he was looking for was a relationship, somebody to share his life with.
You didn't go out to find companionship in a club. You just went out to pick up. That was what generally people did. They weren't there for an affair or a relationship. They just wanted a one-night stand.
He got a job with Manpower Services in the heart of the West End. But the opinionated young Scot struggled to bond with anyone.
He's not somebody who's going to make friends very easily. He's not somebody who's going to be the life and soul of the party. He's far too self-centered. He's far too self-obsessed.
But harassed commuter, harassed London tenant being screwed by the Department of Employment, London Transport, big chain stores, supermarkets. Can you cut there, let me think.
So he's got this quite isolated existence in which he finds it difficult to make friends, in which it's very difficult for him to socialize in any normal way, and that isolation would mean that he would return to his home and lose himself in alcohol. He was a drunk, frankly. I'm not sure he was alcoholic, but he did like to get drunk.
Beer I cannot stand, I got it for free at the bottle party. No.
And he would listen intently to music.
Nilsen was more at ease with machines and objects than he was with people. So music was a way of controlling what was being heard. You can't control a person, you can't control what he's going to say and how he's going to react and how he's going to respond, but you can control the record player.
Here's to you, Mrs. Robinson.
In 1976, Nilsen meets a young drifter called David Galishan. Galishan is unemployed and living in a hostel. And although they're seemingly unsuited, Nilsen seeks out a flat for them both to set up home together.
Tea's ready, Des. Yeah, okay, come in a minute. I got to sign on.
Oh yeah, I'm going to sign on today. I'll sign on again.
Where's that bloody dog? He's been chewing my slippers again.
Here it is. Chewing your slippers, so give it.
I'll wring its bloody neck if I catch it again.
Melrose Avenue was a very old kind of building. It had lots of furniture in it that looks as if it had been bought during the war, really. It was quite old. The carpets weren't very nice, and it was quite a run-down building.
1:10 last night. Son asleep, twink over there, me here. What happens? Crash, bang, what? Have a look, move the camera up there. Have a look at that. Right? Look at the state of that. Whole bloody ceiling falls down. Falls down on me for a start, rips straight across, hits the dog, poor old Pooch, budgie goes up, big row. That wakes you up as well. Great chunks. Bloody great chunks of masonry. I mean, you could kill somebody. Listen to that.
They had French windows which led into a garden. Nobody from upstairs could get into the garden. Only he had the entrance through the French windows.
You're a big nincompoop. Oi, over here.
Over here?
Over here, stand up.
How long do you think it'd take me to dig the garden?
Don't stand there with your hand on your hip, be like a big poof.
But Nilsen's overpowering and controlling nature would drive a wedge between the companions.
Oh, come on, where's my bloody tea then?
Well, tea? Oh, here it is.
David Galishan walked out on him after about 18 months. And that really hurt Nilsen, I'm sure it did.
He was essentially a lonely man by virtue of the fact that he bored everyone and they all left him.
So the thing he's searching for is companionship, a relationship, and it's the one thing that psychologically, sociologically, he's not set up to be able to do.
You're a great pillock, Twinkle.
And then he used to invite more and more people back, hoping that someone would stay.
He did ask me to move in, but I said, I don't think I can put up with you and the bottle. The bottle comes between us, it's too much of it. You've got to stop that. If you stopped it, you'd be a lovely, decent guy to live with. But he couldn't stop that. He couldn't stop that. He seemed to be very into himself. It was all him, him, him. He never hardly asked anything about me.
Anything good you find in this kitchen is probably attributed to my having purchased it in the first place. Bloody light doesn't even go on. Can you go back a bit? I mean, you're far too near.
The lonely Nilsen increasingly took refuge in his morbid private fantasies.
He used to lie on the floor in front of a mirror and put glue on his lips and make his eyes look bloodshot. And he got satisfaction out of regarding himself in the mirror in that way. Not, I don't think, an emotional satisfaction, but a deep requirement of his nature, which was obviously perverted.
He would make out he'd passed out and would fall to the floor. You know, and you go rushing up to him and he'd just be laying there. But I actually know that he wasn't asleep. He wasn't out. He wasn't passed out. He was awake. And he would stay there, and he would stay there, and you'd sit down, you could cook a meal, you could watch television, still be there. But I know that he wasn't asleep. You just know. And it would be in this position of a kind of arms outstretched position. I believe he was pretending to be dead.
All the while, Nilsen continued to play the role of the unremarkable civil servant.
He gets up in the morning, he's a civil servant, he goes to work, he comes home at night. He tends his garden, he cooks for himself, he has a dog which he calls Bleep.
Bleep, come on. Woof, woof, woof. Come on, Bleep, say something.
So there's a sense in which these are the banality, the ordinariness of suburban life.
Ooh, ah, bloody finger, you great pillock.
But of course, Nilsen doesn't really have a sense of how an ordinary life is actually what most people experience, because Nilsen wants to be extraordinary.
On New Year's Day, 1979, 33-year-old Dennis Nilsen woke up next to a teenager he'd met in a pub the night before. The lonely Manpower Services employee later claimed he couldn't face the thought of the sleeping boy leaving.
There came a moment when the murderous impulse to keep this man, not to let him go, overtook him.
Nilsen took a tie, wrapped it around the boy's neck, and pulled.
He was astonished at his strength. At the moment of the murder, he was amazed at how strong he was, because he was not normally a very strong man. Once the murder had occurred, and Nilsen had before him a corpse, he then, in a very peculiar fashion, looked after the corpse.
Now, for the first time, Dennis Nilsen had the means to live out his darkest and most secret fantasies.
He would run a bath, he would bathe it, clean it, he would then make it comfortable, he would dry it, put it into the bed, put it into an armchair.
Nilsen lived with the corpse for a week. He then placed the naked body under the floorboards, where it remained for almost 8 months.
If you have this body, you have to find some way to get rid of it, and you certainly don't want it to be identified as quickly as you possibly can.
Nilsen was efficient. He couldn't relate to a person emotionally, but he could relate to a corpse as something that had to be disposed of. It was a problem that had to be solved. That's much easier than dealing with people and their emotions.
Nilsen's garden would provide the solution.
He burned his body in the garden of Melrose Avenue, obliterating him and spreading his ashes to the four winds.
It was not until 2005 that the victim would be identified as 14-year-old Stephen Holmes. His murder would prove to be merely the beginning.
I think the first murder that any serial killer commits is always the revealing murder. He enjoyed doing it, and I think it's that enjoyment that he got from that first murder that propelled him to kill again and again and again.
Well, this is Soho. and the heart of Soho, Old Compton Street. And this is the area that Nilsen used to favour. He'd come out in his spare time to this kind of area and to gay pubs in particular in order to make contact with people. So he had contact with a lot of youngsters who were coming to London thinking the streets were paved with gold and who were probably no fixed abode, may have run away from home, dropouts, that kind of person.
The people that Nilsen went to meet were people he instinctively, with an uncanny knack, recognised as people who were lonely and would be most likely to accept an invitation to go home.
Often there is no record of these people being reported as missing, and therefore he's tackling a particularly vulnerable group that many other serial killers target.
While living at Melrose Avenue, Dennis Nilsen would pick up and strangle to death a further 11 young men.
If you strangle someone, you feel it, you can touch it. You just grab whatever's at hand and pull.
I have always suspected that Nilsen would strangle the people that he really didn't want to go at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, the ones that he wanted to stay, the ones he didn't particularly want to be with, they'd just go at the end of the night.
That may be true to some extent, but I would look at it in a very different way. I would say that he wanted the bodies to be there because it assured him how in control he was of other people. This is what is arousing to an individual like Nilsen, to be in complete control and domination of others.
Nilsen used the bodies of his victims sexually and in other ways. Nilsen wanted to stay close to these bodies, almost as if they were a form of trophy. He wants to express his power, his complete and utter domination of these young men, even after they're dead.
After he killed them, he would sometimes bring them out and put them in a chair and have conversations with them, as if they were still alive.
They can watch television with him. He can talk to them.
He even would go so far as to come home from work and find the corpse sitting in the same armchair that he'd left him in that morning and saying to him, guess what happened to me today? So this was a substitute for real human company.
Nilsen is so self-obsessed, so desperate for his opinion to be the only opinion that counts and matters, he finds it easier to relate, to have a conversation with a dead young man who isn't capable of answering back.
He would then keep the corpse for quite a few days until they became unbearable. He would eviscerate them. He would put into the garden the spleen and stuff which might be proved impossible to live with, and then put what was left of the corpse under the floorboards.
An obsessive-compulsive personality where somebody is attuned to details and orderliness and so on is very common in prolific serial killers because that personality trait will help them elude law enforcement. They're aware of forensic evidence, they'll clean things up meticulously, and so on.
Ultimately, the bodies that were serving as Nilsen's companions would become an annoyance to him. They were in the way. He needed to get rid of them for a variety of reasons. Firstly, they'd smell. Also, they were an annoyance to him because he keeps wanting to bring more live young men back to his flat.
I would actually stay there for the night or maybe for the weekend or whatever. All I can say is that the smell from Melrose Avenue which you put down to dry rot or whatever, rising down. I don't know, animal smells. It smelled awful, it really smelled nasty. But nothing other than this really stood out, nothing at all.
With no further room under the floorboards, the decomposing corpses were removed, cut into manageable pieces, and taken into the garden.
In the middle of the night, he would have a huge bonfire in his garden, burning the remains, disguising the smell with rubber tires.
And the local children came and danced around the bonfire because they thought it was all rather fun, having not the faintest idea what was going on, really.
Dennis Nilsen had murdered and disposed of 12 young men without arousing suspicion. In 1981, he moved to a new address, where his behavior would become increasingly more bizarre. Between 1979 and 1981, civil servant Dennis Nilsen had murdered and disposed of 12 young men at his flat in Cricklewood. In October of '81, he moved to a rented top-floor flat at 23 Cranley Gardens, Muswell Hill, where his disturbed fantasies would take a new twist. 21-year-old Carl Stotter met the seemingly kind and friendly Nilsen at the Black Cap in Camden.
He took me back to his place. He was a nice guy. He didn't have murderer tattooed across his face or anything like that. He was nice. And I slept with him.
What he did was, first of all, attack him from behind with a tie and throttled him.
He killed me. He strangled me.
He thought he was dead, but he wasn't.
And then he drowned me in a bath of water.
While he thought he was dead, he got himself a rum and coke and lit another cigarette and said to himself, "Oh my God, here we go again," as if this had been done by somebody else.
He described it as being almost in a trance, that he was doing this act without even realizing that he was doing it. And that's fairly typical. Serial murderers will talk about almost waking up and realizing that, oh my gosh, what are they doing?
When he realized the man was alive, he then got extra blankets out. He rubbed his legs to get the blood circulating properly. He put on an extra fire.
Heart massage, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He brought me back to life. And I was there for 3 days.
You've got a classic example of Nilsen initially trying to kill, believing he's killed the victim, but then realizing that the young man is actually still alive. And then Nilsen going into Good Samaritan mode, trying to help the young man get better. Nilsen is able to kind of inhabit a kind of parallel universe in which he no longer sees himself as being someone who's doing wrong, but actually can interpret his actions as somebody who's doing good.
He told me that what happened was I got caught up in the sleeping bag set, and that was it. And I believed him, because you don't think that somebody's going to try and kill you. Anyway, he did.
Carl Stotter would not be the only recipient of Nilsen's Good Samaritan Act. At least 3 more young men would be strangled and then allowed to live. The attacks would remain uninvestigated by the police.
Most of the police would say, well, you were in a bondage game and it's your fault, you participated. And the absolute humiliation of saying, oh gosh, I don't want to be known for this kind of behavior really protects the serial murderer.
It appears Nilsen's odd behavior was not only reserved for strangers.
I fell asleep on the floor. I wouldn't get into the bed. I woke up and he was straddled over me. He had what I call an apple knife. But behind him there was smoke, and there was a gas heater that used to be on the wall, had apparently fallen off. Now, I couldn't possibly have knocked that off with my feet. And it was quite bad. The room was full of smoke. And I said, "What's the knife for?" He said he was trying to cut it, trying to get it right off the wall in case there was an explosion. And I'm positive that when I went to sleep, that gas fire wouldn't have been on because he was already asleep and because it was quite a very mild night. That's all I remember thinking, but then again, thought no more of it. I have to believe that he was going to do something. He was trying to asphyxiate me.
But not everyone would escape with their lives.
With every serial murderer, although they start out slowly, they then become more frenetic and they will start killing a lot more people, a lot more close in time.
The addiction becomes so overwhelming that it's, the corpses pile upon one another.
At Cranley Gardens, 3 men would suffer the same fate as the 12 at Melrose Avenue. But unlike his previous residence, Nilsen's top-floor flat had no space under the floorboards.
He would boil their skulls to get all the flesh off, and then he would chop them up into little bits. To him, the people were just about the same and equivalent to the meat he was chopping up in the army. Had absolutely no reason or meaning emotionally to him. It was just something he did.
Half of one was under the bars. Pieces of another were in the wardrobe in black bags.
On the day that I went back there, on the very last day, and he wouldn't let me into the flat, he was in the strangest mood I've ever seen him in. He was completely flustered, and I couldn't understand what was happening. And the dog ran down the stairs, and he said, "Hold the door, but don't go in." And I thought, charming. I thought, "I've known you all this time, you won't let me into your flat." I said, "He doesn't trust me, obviously." So he brought the dog back up, and he said to me, "You didn't go in." I said, "No, I'm just standing here, aren't I?" And I couldn't work that out.
Nilsen's desperate efforts at disposal would be his undoing. On the 9th of February, blocked drains would lead to his discovery and arrest.
Scotland Yard launched its biggest murder investigation today after a pathologist confirmed that human remains found in a sewer outlet were parts of 3 bodies.
For some strange reason, the minute they said Muswell Hill, they gave no address, they gave nothing. I seem to know that this is him. It's him. I don't know why I would think that. And then an hour later, I was listening more intently, and then they said, in Cranley Gardens. And it was the house. Could you stop it a second?
In custody, Nilsen would describe the murder of 15 young men in minute detail.
He saw no reason to get worked up about it. All right, if you've arrested me, so let's get on with it.
Nilsen gave us every bit of information that he could think of. I mean, we interviewed him 16 times over the next few months. Throughout the interviews, Nilsen was totally matter-of-fact, quite cold. There was no remorse, there was no indication of any remorse at all.
In November, Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment. Over a 4-year period, he had taken the lives of 15 young men. But was the so-called kindly killer born to kill?
Dennis Nilsen was clearly born with a gene which was flawed and which was bound to cause problems in one way or another, just as some people are born with a gene which makes them prone to anger or to jealousy. Nobody is born with an inevitability about his future. The future is shaped by the experience. It may shape the gene which is flawed, but that is not the same thing as saying that there is evil inherent. So Nilsen could have turned out to be a completely different person, not a stable person because of the inherited gene. He would still be flawed, but he need not have become a murderer. The idea that he was born evil is nonsense.
He was brought up in a relatively banal, ordinary circumstances. There were certain elements of his life which were odd or which were difficult for him to overcome. But the circumstances of his childhood and the trials and tribulations of his childhood were not something that were unique to Dennis Nilsen, but were common to many hundreds of thousands of young people. And if Dennis Nilsen was born to kill, so would those hundreds of thousands of young people who had similar circumstances that they had to deal with when they were growing up. So no, I don't believe that Dennis Nilsen was born to kill.
You can be born with a flaw which you've got to keep under control. If you don't keep it under control, it's your fault.
I don't think he was born to kill, but certain circumstances made him that way. Des was a necrophiliac. He was a control freak. I think if he couldn't get what he wanted from a person, like some nights he couldn't with me, then he would, if he wanted it, and he was drunk and he was in the mood for it, and I mean sex, then he would do something to get it, go out of his way to get it. He would, whatever it took.
I think all of these people are to a large degree born to kill. It's a biopsychosocial problem, but biology, in my judgment, has a very large component. We don't know exactly what the specific biology or neurobiological problem is, whether it's genetic, hormonal, chemical, electrical, brain damage, a combination of factors. But there has to be a number of things to go wrong in order for a serial sexual murderer to be created.
Nilsen himself claimed to have wrestled to find a reason for his crimes.
It amazes me that I have no tears for these victims. I have no tears for myself of those bereaved by my actions. Am I a weak person, constantly under pressure, who just couldn't cope with it and escapes to wreak revenge against society through the haze of a bottle of spirits? Or maybe it's because I was just born an evil man. Self-serving crap. For me, this is just specious nonsense, self-serving nonsense to try and justify his behavior.
He's nothing. He's a liar. He's taken human lives. I feel sorry for his mother. To give birth to such a monster.